испытаний, что был осуществлен многочасовой полет. Товарищ Верховный командующий, такое испытание было проведено 21 октября. Действительно, отличие его от предыдущих испытаний, что был осуществлен многочасовой полет ракеты, и в ходе которого она преодолела расстояние 14 тысяч километров. И это не предел. И
на ядерной установке.
На ядерной силовой установке, да. И та технические характеристики буревестник вообще позволяет применять ее с гарантированной точностью по высокозащищенным объектам на любом расстоянии. Кроме того, в ходе полета ракеты были выполнены все заданные вертикальные и горизонтальные маневры, и тем самым продемонстрированы ее высокие возможности по обходу средств противоракетной и противовоздушной обороны.
Сколько тысяч километров?
14 тысяч.
14 тысяч. И в воздухе находилось?
Ну, около 15 часов.
15 часов. И это не предел.
Не предел.
Да. Нам нужно будет, Валерий Алексеевич, определиться, на что это такое, к какому классу оружия эта новая система относится. Надо определить возможные способы применения и начать готовить инфраструктуру для размещения этого оружия в наших вооруженных силах.
Есть.
So this is Putin talking to Gerasimov about a new class of weapon that they have at their disposal. This is a nuclear-powered missile, and I'm trying to pronounce the name of it, the Brezhnik, I think it's what it's called. The missile looks like this. I think I have a picture of this. At least I thought I had a picture of it right here. This missile traveled 14,000 kilometers, and apparently there is no limit to how far the missile can travel. There's a nuclear motor in the missile that allows it to effectively go anywhere in the world and hit anything. It can evade pretty much any missile system or air defense system with horizontal and vertical movements. And anytime you see Putin in camo, you know shit has gotten real. So that was, I guess, the outing to the world of this particular missile, where the test was successful. And this is them effectively presenting a new nuclear cruise missile that can hit any target on the planet to the rest of the world. That is terrifying. Now, obviously, they're not doing this for no reason, right? Meaning this is not them showing this just because it's a Tuesday. They're showing this because the way the world is effectively going. And they probably believe at this point, as I strongly believe they believe, that war, a third world war, is very likely, if not inevitable, depending upon the way things are going militarily. This is them showing it off. This is a new military capability that Russia has at their disposal to pretty much hit any target across the world and evade pretty much any air defense system. At least that's what it's being said, and that's what it's being explained as. This missile is obviously terrifying. Putin didn't just go to the command center in camo to hear about the missile, though. There was also additional information that was relayed. We have this, which is not a good day for Ukraine, to put it mildly.
Товарищи офицеры, товарищ Верховный Главнокомандующий, участники совещания к работе готовы. Начальник главного оперативного управления генерал-полковник Покровского. Здравия желаю, товарищи.
What Gerasimov explained to Putin at that meeting in the command center was that Ukrainian forces were surrounded. Pokrovsk, Kupyanks were both encircled. And not just encircled, you have, I think they said 43 battalions, 31 battalions that are encircled in Kupyanks and Pokrovsk. When these fall, and they will fall, all hell will break loose. This is him breaking down to Putin exactly what is taking place on the ground in those two regions. I'm gonna let it play out.
Сегодня особо выделю два направления. Первое – это полоса ответственности группировки «Центр». соединения и воинские части. Второе, сегодня особо выделю два направления. Первое – это полоса ответственности группировки «Центр», соединения и воинские части 2-й и 51-й армии, наступая по сходящимся направлениям, завершили окружение противника в районе Красноармейска и Димитрова. Блокирована крупная группировка вооруженных сил Украины в составе 31 батальона, в том числе соединения 25-й воздушно-десантный, 79-й десантно-штурмовой и 68-й егерских бригад, а также 35-й и 38-й бригад морской пехоты, 425-го отдельного штурмового полка и 153-й и 155-й механизированных бригад.
Now, Pokrovsk, or Pokrovsk, I think I may be mispronouncing that slightly, was obviously under pressure for a while. Kupyanks was obviously under pressure for a while. And it's not just these two regions. There are additional regions that are also under pressure. Zelensky recently came out saying that the defense in these areas were a challenge. That is a massive understatement. Challenge is doing far too much work, a Herculean task at this point to call that a challenge. But for all intents and purposes, the war continues. In addition to the war continuing, we had Dmitry Medvedev come out with a statement where he pointed out, look, if negotiations are broken down, fair enough. That is perfectly fine. We could stop pretending that there is some kind of negotiation taking place, and we can go after the military targets that we need to go after without this idea of negotiations, meaning negotiations was somewhat of a hedge to Russia, let's say, pursuing more vigorously the military objectives. Now, in addition to surrounding these two areas, Russia has also gone on what seems to be a campaign against the energy architecture of Ukraine. And so there were attacks on Kiev last night, but there were also attacks in various areas where they were going after infrastructure and the power grid. The last report showed that the power grid was down by 50%, and 50% of the energy production of Ukraine had been destroyed. Well, that number has gone up to 60%. So Russia has effectively continued their war fighting while also simultaneously trying to work on a diplomatic track. After Trump passed the sanctions, you've had Dmitry Kirillov, I believe his first name is Dmitry, came to the United States in order to have this push for further negotiations, with the Russians still saying, hey, who said the meeting is canceled? Nobody said the meeting in Budapest is canceled, and it's not canceled because the date for the meeting was never set. Meaning they're still using this diplomatic language in the way that they talk about this stuff, despite the fact that Dmitry Medvedev was very strident in his point of saying, negotiations are fair enough. That is perfectly fine. We settled this on the battlefield. So this illusion of negotiations continue to take place. Ukraine has attempted to take down a dam in Belgorod, using HIMARS missiles. Now, the reason that is interesting is because I've made this argument for the last month or so that Donald Trump has been searching for leverage. That despite the Alaska summit, despite the offer that Witkoff made, despite the response that Putin gave, Trump never gave an official response. The official response that Trump gave was effectively having an oil war to go after, let's say, installations to try to stem the tide of Russian energy, using that as leverage. Okay, but that didn't work. Because the moment that Russia started going after Ukraine's architecture, obviously the infrastructure of Ukraine couldn't necessarily hold up to the barrage that Russia was effectively waging. Russia could hold up to the barrage, in which case, obviously, Trump got no leverage in that situation. So now they're going after a dam. Now, this dam will affect like 1,000 people, if not more, all of which are civilians. We were told that any HIMARS launch has to have the fingerprints of the United States on those launches. And so, that's interesting. So first, you had terrorist attacks. Terrorist attacks, by the way, that Donald Trump waited days before he said anything about, which I kept pointing out, Donald Trump was obviously involved in those terrorist attacks. Then you get these attacks on energy architecture, which it became clear that the United States was directly involved in getting Ukraine to make those attacks and Ukraine can make those attacks without the help of the United States. And now you have attacks on a bridge using HIMARS, a weapon system that we were told that the United States had something to do. Its fingerprints was always on any strike of HIMARS. And again, they're going after a dam. This is not a military target. This is a target to effectively inflict casualties on the civilian population. I keep pointing out, this is a hunt for leverage. This is a search for leverage. Now, the Russians may still be using this diplomatic language, which annoys me to no end, because how do you engage in diplomacy with psychopaths, right? Like, you have people who want your destruction, full stop. And so trying to negotiate with somebody that wants you to lose and wants you to fail, and under no circumstances can accept the deal by which, let's say the U.S. takes an L in that deal, it's kind of difficult to do. And yet the Russians continue, to the chagrin of a lot of us who look at this and say, dude, you're not going to get a deal with the United States. Now, especially a fake ceasefire. Keep in mind, Donald Trump has been running around the globe telling people that he's been settling 20 different conflicts. All of this stuff is nonsense, right? But despite the fact that it's nonsense, even with the ceasefire, quote unquote, in Gaza, which was never a ceasefire at all, because Israel has continued to murder the population and they've continued to prevent food from going into Gaza. Donald Trump wants a fake win. Putin is not going to give Donald Trump a fake win. It is imperative from the Russian point of view that the Ukrainians lose, that NATO loses, that the United States loses. And it's understood to be a loss. At least that's the way Medvedev put it, that they need to understand 3 a.m. between them and their God that they failed, and they failed miserably at this particular task. Now, the question, and I suspect that the reason that they're showing that new missile system is whether or not that will be accepted. Meaning, is there a point where Europe, where NATO, where the United States relents, where they say, okay, fair enough, we accept our failure? Now, the problem with this, as I keep pointing out, is there's no feedback mechanism for this. What is the incentive for the United States? What is the incentive for Europe to say, okay, fair enough, we lost. We failed at this task? There isn't one. Now, if Russia has to take all of Ukraine, okay, fair enough. The question will become, okay, does Europe get involved or does the United States get involved? But short of that, what is the feedback mechanism? Russia has isolated all of their attacks to Ukraine. So the only people who die are Ukrainians. Europeans may die from the standpoint of mercenaries or people pretending to be mercenaries. Fair enough. You may get a small contingent of them effectively dying where, you know, they would say Belgian troops were in a skiing accident and 1,000 of them died in a skiing accident. Okay, you may get something like that. But it's not like 10,000 French troops have been killed and go back in body bags. 5,000 Americans come back in coffins. It's not that. And because you don't have that, what is the mechanism to say, what is the leverage? What is the thing that affects the US, or for that matter, affects Europe in a way that says, okay, we need to stop this? I'm trying to point out it doesn't exist. We don't care if Ukrainians die. The people who wave the flag of Ukraine the hardest care less about the fact that Ukrainians are dying. We don't care. We don't care that the cemeteries are full. We don't care that they're missing limbs. We don't care that they're losing territory. We don't care that this winter is going to be a brutal, brutal winter for the Ukrainians, considering that the energy architecture has been effectively destroyed, or at the very least systematically destroyed, or the infrastructure. We don't care. And I'm saying we don't care because we obviously don't care. What we care about is geopolitical interests of going after the Russians. That's what we care about. Ukrainians matter less. I would go so far as to say they don't matter at all. They are a proxy to accomplish an objective. A proxy to accomplish an objective in the sense that there are two. And of course, if your hammer gets chipped, do you care all that much? Not so much. That sounds brutal. That sounds horrible. And yet, everything I just said is perfectly true. It's one thing, and again, this is kind of the Gaza issue again, right? when I would have guests on the show and we would talk about Gaza, I would point out it is one thing for people to feel some kind of way about it. That's one thing. Would they set themselves on fire over it? Would they lose their jobs over it? Are they willing to, put themselves and extend themselves in a way where there's personal individual risk for them doing so, where there's personal hardship? Some may, but not in sufficient numbers to do anything about it. And part of the reason is there's no feedback mechanism. Donald Trump can go and say, hey, let's make a deal on this particular issue, but Donald Trump wants to look good in that deal. Donald Trump is not going to look good in any kind of deal because he would have to accept a surrender that the U.S. president just can't accept. And so the war continues. It's one thing if it was like the Iraq War or Vietnam War, and you had flag-draped coffins coming back by the thousands. Okay, well then the American public is going to be pissed, right? That's my uncle, that's my brother, that's my cousin, that's my sister, that's my whatever. You feel some kind of way about it, and you're willing to extend yourself because you feel some kind of way about the loss that you've just encountered. Where is that in Ukraine? Where is it? Where is it? There are no flag-draped coffins coming back to America. We're spending money, but that's it. And even in the context of money, Donald Trump is trying to limit the amount of money he's even spending in that sense. And so what you end up getting is a business deal. The U.S. can sell weapons. Hey, that's great. We can support our weapons manufacturers in the sense of giving weapons over to Europe. Europe wants to keep going in this conflict, especially being pushed by the U.S. on some level. And so what is the incentive for any of these countries? You can make an economic argument and say, well, Europe is getting damaged economically in the process of them proceeding and continuing with the war. That's true. But that seems to apparently matter less than what it would mean for Europe to accept the fact that they failed on a massive effing level. Meaning relevance in this case is mattering more. What is the relevance of NATO? If NATO spends, 50, 60 years preparing for a war with the Soviet Union and all of the states of the Soviet Union collapses, NATO remains. And on top of NATO remaining, they go after the beating heart of the Soviet Union, not even the entirety of the Soviet Union, and they lose. What does it mean for the legitimacy of NATO? What does it mean for the U.S. prominence in the world? Meaning all of these things are wrapped up into this particular conflict. And because these things are wrapped up into the conflict, those things are going to matter more than the lives of individual Ukrainians, or for that matter, the state of Ukraine as a political entity in and of itself. There is no feedback mechanism. And so there's no incentive in a real sense. There's no push to end the war. So Ukrainians will continue to die. Russia will continue to take territory. Pokrovsk, Kupyanks, they will fall. And Russia will accomplish the objective of taking the entirety of the Donbass. And I think Mark is right. Putin is going to, because he's a diplomat, are we finished this? And they're going to say no, in which case Russia will continue in their plight. That seems to be what's taking place. I mean, if Donald Trump is talking about a Budapest summit and he's like, well, hey, I'll have the summit and I'll have the conversation and we can get something accomplished. Are you going to surrender? Trump is going to say no, in which case the war continues. Even if we accept Putin's demands as maximalists, quote unquote, losers don't get to dictate terms. And so if Putin is saying, look, this is what we need, and they've been consistent the entire way through in the conflict, assume for the moment that those demands are maximalist, and assume for the moment that there's some leeway in those demands. There's certain core parts of those demands that are not going anywhere. Ukraine being a neutral entity, that's not going anywhere, which means that the government that's in Ukraine right now has to implode, fall, or be removed. The 5 territories, part of Russia, full stop. They're part of the Russian Federation. Ukrainian troops need to leave those areas. Meaning there's certain parts of that aren't going anywhere. Ukraine not being part of NATO, which goes into the whole neutrality issue. Those things are not going anywhere. And the U.S. president will have to, A, accept it, B, get the Europeans on board to accept it. and C, somehow get that through Congress. And even if they don't necessarily get it through Congress, I would argue they would have to. But let's say they don't. Can a U.S. president accept it? It's kind of a hard sell, right? Kind of a hard sell. So the war continues, and Russia prepares for Third World War with weapon systems that are utterly and entirely terrifying. Utterly, entirely terrifying. Yeah. So that's where we are on that front. I don't like to preempt, I guess, but that is one of the main stories that we're hitting today. Mark is going to be here at 8:15. We're going to hit that further. He's going to delve further into the military situation on the ground in those regions, and I would imagine in other regions that are also under pressure. Keep in mind, tomahawks would not have changed the context of the war. What tomahawks would have done, most likely, if you're listening to Doctorow, is for Russia to declare war. Meaning there's a technical legal difference between a special military operation, which is limited, which annoys a lot of us, because from our point of view, get it over with. But they're limited in what they're deciding they want to do in regards to how they want to fight this war, as opposed to we are declaring actual war. Those are two very different things. And so Trump backed away from the tomahawks because he probably understood the consequences of him doing that and didn't necessarily want to deal with those consequences. That may be temporary, though. If Russia takes Kiev, what does Europe do? What does the US do? Those are question marks. The question marks. Meaning you can imagine that the pressure that is going to be on those world leaders who have effectively failed in their task after going with this fool's campaign for 3 years, the pressure will be immense. Now, the other part of this is, and I strongly suspect this was probably true, from Europe's point of view, they just want Ukraine to keep going to the last dead Ukrainian. And some of them may even have this fanciful ideas of getting themselves prepared militarily to fight the Russians if Ukraine can last for another 3 years. That sounds like a tall order, but okay. That seems to be what they may be potentially trying to do. The other part of this is overextend Russia. Meaning, if the plan is to overextend Russia, you may say, let him take all of Ukraine. Let's see him do it. Let's see him swallow. Let's see him choke on that bone. If you have to call up 3 million in the military in order to take over Ukraine, well, that's 3 million people that are effectively going to be part of an occupation force of at the very least the western part of the country. That's a tall order. But that may be the order that is on the menu. Like, it's hard to know how this stuff turns out. I don't believe for a moment that Russia wants to take all of Ukraine, which is why they keep continuing with this kind of political push to try to get some level of a deal. But the problem with any kind of deal is that if you allow a rump state, and that rump state can fill itself with just, this rump state of NATO, then you're back in the same situation that you were in when you first started the conflict. How do you allow that? Yeah. Look, I've asked that question for the last 2 years when I was at the radio station and this war first started. I think we were 6 months, 8 months in, and I was like, how do we end this? How does this end? Anytime that you stop, they're going to continue to fill themselves up with weapons with this kind of push to try to have another offensive. How does it end? And up to this point, nobody has had an answer for that, short of, well, we may have to take it all. We may have to take it all. So yeah, there is, I know that's grim. I know that's not necessarily an assessment that people want to hear, but I don't really have an answer for it. And yeah, this slow push seems to be accelerating in regards to the Russian point of view, especially after they take Donbass. From my understanding, the military defenses after they take Donbass are limited from the standpoint of the Ukrainian side, in which case this escapade will accelerate. But we're 3 years in, we're going to go into at least 2026. Ukraine will collapse at some point. What that looks like, anybody's guess. Anybody's guess. We have to also talk about Venezuela. Caleb will be on a little bit later today to have a conversation about what is taking place with Venezuela. The Venezuela thing is rather mind-blowing. Two things. One, Trump murdering fishermen is not entirely different than Obama murdering people in Syria in his drone strikes. Meaning when Obama decided, hey, I'm going to have a kill list, and I'm going to use that kill list to murder people, it was in the Middle East. And because it was in the Middle East, it wasn't something that we got to see with our own eyes. So when he was doing drone strikes and he was killing this person, killing that person, well, that wasn't necessarily something that we entirely got to see with our own eyes. And so it's kind of remote. Do you remember, I think it was a football player, when that football player, it came out that he beat his girlfriend. And people are like, oh, that's horrible. He beat his girlfriend. That's not a good thing to do. That's pretty bad. But there wasn't a huge amount of uproar over it. It was kind of just like, that's unfortunate. You shouldn't do that. Then they showed the picture of him hitting her in the elevator and just flattened her. All hell broke loose. Being able to see it is different than conceptually knowing it. Those are two very different things. Meaning me having visual appraisal of something and seeing how bad something actually is gives it a new reality, as opposed to the reality in my mind that is kind of a minor thing in the context of what it actually is in real terms. Us seeing this, for example, is different than you just being told. You have a boat. Military follows an illegal order and murders the people in the boat. Now, pretend for the moment that you didn't get the opportunity to see it, but somebody just told you. Those are two very different things. Donald Trump has murdered 23 people under the guise of going after drugs. Now, this is nonsense. I pointed out when this first took place that a speedboat doesn't have the capability of getting to the United States, or at the very least, without being refueled multiple times. And the size of that boat, it would make no sense for them to be carrying, quote unquote, drugs, fentanyl, or whatever the hell Donald Trump is claiming that they're carrying in the boat to get all the way to the United States. That seems like a tall order for a speedboat to do that. And yet the U.S. has been murdering these people left and right for the past, couple of months, using military force to do so. Donald Trump has also moved, let me find the exact boat. I believe it's the Ford, but I want to get the right boat into the region. And again, you have to ask the question, okay, well, why is Donald Trump doing this? Drop Site News has pointed out, based on internal conversations, right here, U.S. intelligence. U.S. Intel has assessed that little to none of fentanyl traffic to the United States is being produced in Venezuela. Let me repeat that. U.S. intelligence has assessed that little to none of the fentanyl traffic to the United States is being produced in Venezuela. This is despite recent claims from the Trump administration. Senior U.S. official directly familiar with the matter tells Drop Site News. The official noted that many of the boats targeted for the strikes by Trump administration do not even have the requisite gasoline or motor capacity to reach the United States waters. And they said dramatically undercutting any claims by Secretary of War, Hegseth. The claim is backed up by recent comments made by Senator Rand Paul, who similarly noted that zero fentanyl is being produced in Venezuela. It makes no sense. And you would think that the media would immediately say, hey, this makes no sense. But the media doesn't say that. And not just not say that, 60 Minutes, and I can't show it because I would immediately get dinged for trying to show it. 60 Minutes goes on a propaganda exercise about removing Maduro. That's amazing. So U.S. media, as opposed to doing its job saying, wait a minute, this is outrageous. Venezuela is not producing fentanyl. Maduro is not a narco president. Unlike Hernandez, that was in, I believe, Honduras, that the United States actually put into office, who was a narco president and was eventually extradited to New York for prosecution. They just want Maduro removed. Now, there are multiple reasons why they want Maduro removed. One is there's a huge amount of oil under the soil of Venezuela. It's like, hey, man, you have the unfortunate distinction of being the president of a country that has a huge amount of oil that we prefer to get our hands on. So, sad day. So now you need to come up with a rationale for it, because you can't necessarily do it nakedly. I would almost prefer them do it nakedly and just say, look, we want the oil, we want it removed, and we don't like the relationships you have with Russia and China. So there's that. But they don't do that. They never do this stuff nakedly. They always come up with some fig leaf of a rationale. And the media, of course, I made this argument before, and I'll make this argument again. There is no such thing as neutral media. Media is never a neutral entity. And if media is being a neutral entity, then by definition of the being neutral, they are being unfair to one of the sides in a particular issue. If you see a genocide taking place, and your response is, well, I need to both sides this, then you are giving cover to the people who are committing the genocide. Imagine the massacre of Native Americans, and you have a media personality on the ground saying, well, I mean, the Native Americans did hit this particular group of Americans, and the Americans hit this particular group of Native Americans. You choose. Obviously, you're doing a disservice to the fact that they are committing a genocide, right? The same thing is true in Israel. If the BBC is running stories where they're acting as if this is a war and that they're both sidesing this, and when Israel murders a lot of people, they say something to the fact that they use neutral language. 31 people died in a strike. It's like, no, Israel murdered 31 people or whatever the number is. I'm saying neutrality in the context of news is often at the disadvantage of one side or the other. There is no such thing as neutral news. By definition of the neutrality, they are being dishonest. And I'm saying the same thing is true here. If you're looking at this and you're saying, well, Donald Trump says that he's going after drugs, and you frame it in the context of going after drugs, going after cocaine, Maduro is illegitimate. We don't like Maduro because he's a dictator. Forgetting the fact that we have worked with plenty of dictators. In fact, we love working with dictators because, you know, for all intents and purposes, when you have to work with a democracy, you have to deal with multiple people within the context of the government. And that government may tell you to F off, which you don't particularly like, whereas if you work with a dictator, you work with one guy. I'm saying this argument was always nonsense. Habitual liars lie. Donald Trump is a habitual liar. And so the idea that a habitual liar says, that's a drug boat, so we can now militarily murder whoever's on the boat, is outrageous. And you would think that an honest, legitimate media will call it so. But instead, we give cover by giving leeway to this idea that they're carrying drugs. And by the way, even if they were, the idea that you're murdering these people is outrageous. If it was a drug boat, and you know where the drug boat is, why not just follow the drug boat? You have drones. You have other tools. You can catch those people the moment that those people try to reach shore, right? Meaning you're going after and just murdering human beings, knowing full well that this has nothing to do with drugs. This has everything to do with regime change. And there's some military channels that are looking at this now that are pointing out saying, hey, this seems to be more than a pressure campaign. This seems to be more than just, you know, this idea of quote unquote going after drugs. It seems as if this is an active regime change. They deployed the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier to South America. I was right. It's Gerald Ford. This is outrageous. It should be called such. This has nothing to do with drugs. This has nothing to do with fentanyl. This has nothing to do with quote unquote cocaine. This has nothing to do with Maduro being quote unquote illegitimate. This has nothing to do with Maduro being a dictator. And even if he was illegitimate, even if he was a dictator, that is an issue for Venezuela. That is not an issue for the United States. This is everything to do about oil. This is everything to do about the relationship of Maduro with China and with Russia. It's that Monroe Doctrine 2.0. The question that I have is, what is Latin America going to do about it? They put sanctions on Gustavo Petro, so there's that. He has been pretty loud about it, considering that some of the people that was murdered were Colombians. There's a report out that CIA was caught in Trinidad and Tobago. There's that. There's a belief that Guyana is effectively working with the United States on this, because there's a conflict between between Venezuela and Guyana. And so the thought is that the United States is effectively working with Guyana as a way of, let's say, getting into a conflict with Venezuela. What's more interesting, in this drop site article, they point out that Colombia is involved in this. They point out that this is Rubio's push, that the money, if you remember when Trump got in office, he made this big push of, we're getting rid of USAID and we're getting rid of NED. Okay, well, they didn't get rid of those things. Those things were put into the State Department. Rubio runs the State Department. And so a lot of the money that they've been using it effectively going into various entities in order to try to overthrow Ukraine, right here. Rubio seems to be running this particular policy. Now, at one point, the news was reporting that Maduro told Trump, okay, well, look, you can get the oil. I'll give you the oil. This is drop site's response. Rubio's policy was most recently at a crossroads after Maduro offered to turn over the oil resources to the United States in exchange for cessation of hostilities. Trump acknowledged the offer in a recent appearance, saying Maduro, quote, offered everything. You know why? Because he doesn't want to fuck around with the United States. I have serious qualms with the president. That's a degradation of culture. But let's keep going. Trump rejected the offer after being swayed by arguments from Rubio that the best way to secure Venezuela's oil reserves was to facilitate regime change in Venezuela and to make a better deal with the new government, the sources say. So effectively, we put in a puppet government and then we rape them blind of their resources. A recent U.S. government assessment of Venezuelan oil exports to China found that nearly 500,000 barrels a day, a small fraction of the country's total capacity, which Donald Trump is turning down in the immediate term. Right here, here's the other one. Much of the U.S.-backed resistance to Maduro, including the disastrous Operation Gideon, coup planned in May 2020, has been based out of Colombia and Guyana. In late September, the United States Department of International Law Enforcement signed a 2-year, $4.6 million, quote, Colombia virtual shooting range, unquote, contract with the Arizona-based Vitra, Inc. There were also 2 foreign military sales through the U.S. Coast Guard, $1.73 million for an undisclosed number of 21-foot boats signed on September 12th, a $3.8 million for 8 25, quote, heavy combat riverine boats, unquote, signed 4 days later. The Arlington branch of the international consulting firm Deloitte also received a 3-year, $3 million contract with the United States Department Bureau of Energy Resources for services in Colombia on September 30th, following years of mineral advisory work in the region. This doesn't seem to be a pressure campaign, as people initially thought. This seems to be a regime change war with a military buildup in the Caribbean using Puerto Rico, and I would imagine probably using Guyana, and in some way using Colombia as a staging ground for it. Now, this is wild since the Colombian president seems to be completely against this, but there's all sorts of military, U.S. military in Colombia. Keep an eye on this. Keep an eye on this. As somebody wrote in an article, Venezuela is not Panama. Panama had military bases. Panama was a small area, a small country. Venezuela is a country of 30 million people. It is a huge country. Yeah, pay attention to it. That's all. It's just outrageous that this is. You would think that after weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and what 3 million of how many ever people, military people get killed in that regime change war, and the war was entirely based on a lie. When Nancy Pelosi was presented with this, Nancy Pelosi at one point said, well, we knew it was a lie, which calls into question Pelosi, right? They impeached Donald Trump twice. Once over complete nonsense of Russiagate that didn't exist. The second time was legitimate, and Trump should have been put in a cage over trying to overthrow the government of the United States. I'm not going to get into my argument for that, but you get my point. George Bush invaded the country on the premise of a lie. Not even getting into the 9/11 stuff. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And yet, George Bush decided to use the 9/11 event as a way of reshaping the Middle East through the U.S. power, military might. Did we care about the troops that were going to die? No. Did we care that over 1 million Iraqis were killed? No. Did we care that this, spurred ISIS and all of these other insane groups? No, we didn't care. I'm saying that for a country to live through that, to spend $10 trillion to do that, and then for a similar situation of there's cocaine, there's fentanyl coming out of Venezuela, which we fully understood stand as a lie. It's a thin veil lie at that. And the country is like, oh, well, Maduro's a dictator. We don't like dictators. Despite the fact that we work with dictators all the time. We install dictators, for God's sake. That's an amazing thing. Meaning that goes beyond, how can I say, I'm not trying to communicate this. There is a level, this country seems to be anesthetized. And what I mean by that, I don't know if it's because, you have sex with your wife, girlfriend, mistress, whoever. You play your Xbox, you eat your McDonald's, you work your job, you deal with your kids. You have a life. And in the context of their life, it's almost as if we consider government to be a job. And what I mean by that is, in the same way that we have our jobs and we have specific responsibilities in our jobs. Well, I'm not really caring what Bob does. I care what I do in the context of my job because this is the job I get paid for. Bob is doing something else. I only really care what Bob does if what Bob does affects me in some kind of way. So if Bob is fucking up, then that's on Bob. That's not on me. Government doesn't entirely work that way. And yet that seems to be the way that we look at the way government operates. Well, Donald Trump is handling that. The government is handling that. That's their responsibility. And if they're messing up, then we may say something if it affects us. But if it doesn't directly affect us, then it's like, dude, your government is out there murdering people. A, it was back in genocide. There's that. 2, it's supporting a war in Ukraine that was always a lie and a premise based on a lie. We've just went through, like 20 years ago, the war in Iraq. And now Donald Trump is using a thinly veiled lie to murder a lot of people in Venezuela. And we're like, oh, well, when is the new video game coming up? I don't know. That's mind-blowing to me. And yeah, when I say that the military is following illegal orders, murdering people in Venezuela, same thing with torture, right? We're not going to call it torture. We're going to call it enhanced interrogation. And because we call it enhanced interrogation, it makes it okay to effectively break human beings, despite the fact that it's against our law, and despite the fact that everybody knows that they were lying and that torture was actually torture. It's amazing. John Kiriakou was put in a cage for it. If it wasn't torture, why did they put John Kiriakou in a cage for saying that it was torture? I'm saying that this idea that we have decided that it is okay to do this is amazing. In the old days, this wasn't revealed to the Americans. Do you remember? I'm old enough to remember the Iran-Contra affair. I think that was the big event when I was a child or when I was growing up. And I remember sitting there looking at this huge floor model TV with the Gipper coming on. And the Gipper comes out and makes this argument saying, look, I just come to awareness that we were paying for kill squads in South America and that we were getting money from an enemy by selling them weapons. And despite the fact that there was a Bolin Act that said, don't do this, don't pay for kill squads in South America to try to overthrow governments, lo and behold, we were doing it. Now, I'm the Gipper. I didn't know anything about this, but the buck stops with me. So, hashtag sorry. And then it goes off. And you have, Oliver North sitting in front of Congress being beat over the head, explaining what took place and was effectively the face of the Iran-Contra affair, the fall guy for it. In those days, it was a big deal that the United States was effectively doing that. And it was taboo to bring up that we were overthrowing governments in South America, or for that matter, in Iran, or for that matter, at whatever other country that you want to. I think it's like 50 different governments or something like that. Don't take my word for the number, but the number is high. The public was not made aware of that. And it wasn't made aware of that because America was supposed to be freedom, justice, love, light. We believe in democracy. We want to work with democracies. We want a world full of democracies. Hell, we even have National Endowment for Democracies. That is super ironic that we even call it that. I'm saying in the old days, the American public being aware of this was a no-no. And some point that changed where not only was it not a no-no for the public to know, at some point it just became aware that the public didn't care. So when Obama is spending all of this money to overthrow the Syrian government, like billions of dollars, it was met with a shrug. And now, even more blatant, because Sycamore timber wasn't necessarily something that was exposed to the public until Obama got out of office, even though we knew Obama was doing it, because all sorts of reporting was coming out that Obama was doing it. Hell, Tulsi Gabbard even came out on the news saying, we are paying terrorists to overthrow the government of Syria. She said it on CNN, and Jake Tapper was shocked by the whole thing. Oh, what? The government says it's not doing that. Jake, obviously the government was doing it. And now this idea of it being taboo, of it being something that, well, we don't really want the public to know this. At some point, they came to the awareness that the public doesn't care one way or the other. I find it to be amazing. You would think that we would give a shit that our government is murdering people in our name and using our tax dollars to do so. And apparently, the country does not. That is amazing. You would think that the country would be more concerned about the fact that our subways are failing, that we don't have high-speed rail, that healthcare is woefully inadequate, that we die younger, that our infrastructure is crumbling. You would think that we would care about those things, that our standard of life is depreciating year by year, that our debt is $38 trillion or heading to $38 trillion. And again, put that in context. It's one thing if your debt was $38 trillion and you had brimming the best healthcare on the planet, the best infrastructure on the planet. You had candelabras in your subways, and they were spotless, that you were getting all of these services from the government and everything else. We get none of those things. We get none of those things. And yet, $38 trillion, at the very least, we're headed there, and we will be there soon. How does a country that owes that much money that we would never pay back, that has little to no services in real sense of the term, especially in comparison to other countries like in Europe or whatever, how is that country okay with spending even $1 overthrowing other governments? And yet, here we are. Or here we are again. Just amazing candelabras. It was something that Jon Stewart pointed out when Tucker Carlson went to Moscow, and he was in the subway systems of Moscow. Moscow has gorgeous subway systems. I've never been to Moscow, but I've seen their subway systems. Spotless, gorgeous. And he made this point about candelabras being there. And his basic argument was dirty, piss-smelling, crack pipe laced subway systems is the price of freedom. And I said, Jon Stewart is out of his goddamn mind. It's like you're in California and there are homeless people laying on the ground. It's like, this is the price of freedom. If that is the price of freedom, we are doing something woefully wrong. But he used it up candelabras. He was like, there's candelabras. is what it is. I hope you get my point. The government is making choices that is not in our interests. And you would think that a functional government would be able to keep the lights on. And yet, we are over a month where the government is closed. We saw, and I think I played the clip, service members of our military who decide that they're going to put their lives on the line to kill or die for this country at food banks. That is amazing. That is amazing, right? Like the idea that you're spending what, like $1 trillion for the military, and you have, I would say, philosophical, legal relationship. It's almost like a bond, a promise to your military members. We need you to go out, kill, and die for us. We will pay your pension. We'll cover your health care. You get a salary for doing so. And we still expect them to do those things as they don't get paid. And the idea where you have all of these service members at a food bank effectively having to get a handout, despite the fact that they're working for the U.S. government, is outrageous. And even, beyond the military part, just people who work for the government in general, who are standing in lines that go blocks long, trying to get food because the government can't keep the lights on. This stuff is outrageous. And yet, that same government that can't even keep the lights on is making the choice to go and murder a lot of people in Venezuela. There's something wrong with this. I hope you get my point. There's something woefully inadequate. There's something deeply problematic about a government that A, can't function, but can function well enough to go murder other people abroad. That's profound. That's profound. And yet that is our government. That is what the government is doing right now as we speak in our name. And of course, the military will follow those orders, despite the fact that there's no legitimacy to what the Trump administration is doing. Every bit as much there was no legitimacy to what George Bush was doing, or for that matter, Obama was doing. They're doing this stuff for geopolitical gamesmanship. There's an argument that could be made that this is also geopolitical in regards to everybody knows that a war is coming. Maybe Trump doesn't know because Trump is not altogether there and probably won't be here for 5 years. But the rest of the global players, China, Russia, India, the US, etc., Europe, they know that there is a sense of war. And many of these countries seem to be trying to get some level of geopolitical positioning in the context for that push. And if you have the oil reserves of Venezuela in your back pocket, would that be a good thing or bad thing in the context of you trying to wage and fight a war? Well, obviously the answer is yes. Not to mention, if you want to depreciate the price of oil in order to damage Russia in some way to get leverage, again, that is also positive. Obviously, though, that's not going to take place within the course of 6 months. That would take place over the course of years, in which case, who knows if the world will still be running on oil. Either way, putting away just the blunt geopolitical rationale for doing something like this is obviously disgusting. We are going to murder a lot of people if Trump goes through with this. What Latin America does is also really interesting to me. What does Brazil do? What does Colombia do? What does, the other countries that are in the region that are surrounding Venezuela, what do they do? Especially if you're going to just create complete political destabilization in that country and create something that you got out of the Middle East. Obviously, it's not in their best interest for something like that to take place. I don't have this expectation that Brazil goes to war with the United States or that these other countries go to war with the United States. But there has to be some level of pushback and resistance to what the United States and the Trump administration is doing in Venezuela, because what happens in Venezuela is not going to stay in Venezuela. Mark my words. This will be a disaster. It could be a disaster. But we will see. I think Mark described the United States as or Trump as a child with a gun. That despite the fact of being incompetent, being mentally not altogether there, that for all intents and purposes, is still dangerous nonetheless. And I think that's what we're looking at. As an aside to this, I have stridently made the argument that there is no such thing as international law. I will go further. I don't think there's such thing as law in general. Even governments are legal fictions. They're organization of energy that people accrue and organize themselves around in order to create some kind of structure for a society that can grow and prosper, ideally to the benefit of the citizens in that society. Otherwise, what's the point? But international law specifically is a problem. How do you have law without any ability to enforce that law, right? Like if I say no smoking, and that's a law. We don't allow smoking. We don't allow drugs. But there are no cops. How do you enforce the law? How do you stop the guy from smoking weed if indeed there's nothing or no consequence for the guy smoking weed? I'm saying that is international law. There is no Leviathan over top of governments. There is no king. There is no God. There is no, space alien that is over top of everything. There's only countries, and those countries make a choice about whether they do or whether they don't do. And regardless of what these countries may agree to, at the end of the day, if the countries decide, well, we don't really care that a genocide is taking place, then a genocide would take place. And if you have, let's say, a larger country that the other countries are scared of, that genocide is definitely going to take place, because despite all of the bitching and complaining, nobody is really going to get involved. I always make the point of saying international law doesn't exist. I've had international lawyers on the show. And again, they're stuck with this idea of, well, it's necessary in theory for it. It's necessary to have a benchmark for the way people behave. And ideally, countries will come around. Okay, that's not the same thing as a law. That's a suggestion. Those are very different things. And I think the Venezuela thing makes that point. The Ukraine thing even makes that point. I mean, for God's sake, they overthrew a government, right? The Syria thing makes that point. They overthrew a government. We were paying terrorists in order to do so. And you can look at the governments that we've effectively knocked over. International law didn't matter in any of that context. And international law is not going to matter in the situation for Venezuela. Will anybody else get involved? The answer is no. The answer is no. We are in the law of the jungle. These institutions, quote unquote, that once existed, that once people cared about, that once people gave energy to and gave credibility to, these things have fundamentally, entirely failed. If you look at the chemical one for Syria, the name will come to me in a moment. Yeah, it'll come to me in a moment. That report was doctored in order to make it look as if Syria was dropping chemical weapons. Assad had taken back, with the help of Russia and Iran, 80% of the territory. And they were like, well, he obviously dropped the weapon. And here's a report. And despite the fact that the people who wrote the original report came out and said, that is not a report. And that we were pushed and moved out, and a new report was put into its place to incite or to implicate the Syrian government in dropping chemical weapons. It'll come to me in a moment. It didn't matter that they came out and said that. It's still, people ran with the idea that, well, Assad was dropping chemical weapons. And he said, well, why would he do that? He's a bad guy. That's why he would do it. He's a bad guy. Him being a bad guy is the reason he'll do it? He's a cartoon villain? Is that what you're trying to tell us? The man clung to power like grim death against Wahhabis, jihadists that were chopping heads and burning people in cages. But he's a bad guy, so he's going to take an action that may provoke other countries to get involved into the conflict, something that obviously he doesn't necessarily want to take place. And they would say, yes. It's nonsense. An agency that was supposed to be independent, obviously, was not. The International Criminal Court, same thing, right? They would lock up African dictators, but look how long it took them to go after Israel after it was obviously murdering people left and right, starving, obviously committing a genocide. And the ICC took forever. Instead, what did they do? They said, well, Putin is stealing kids. Putin is stealing kids. So Russia removing kids from the battlefield is equivalent to Putin stealing kids. Okay, this is always nonsense. But again, they passed an arrest warrant over it. Now, Russia's not even part of the Rome Statute. So how on earth are you passing an arrest warrant for somebody that was not even part of your statutes? But again, it became a political institution in a way that it was operating. Look at the Nobel Peace Prize. Same thing. They gave it. And if you look at the last people who they gave it to, they were giving it to people who were effectively in opposition to various governments that they didn't necessarily like. So they give it to a woman, Peace Prize, that wants military action against her government. That's amazing. How are you giving the Peace Prize to somebody who's advocating for military action? And giving it to Obama. And what did Obama do? Obama came out and effectively made a speech about the necessity, or sometimes wars are necessary. Now, whether the speech is true or not, which I do think wars are necessary at times, is irrelevant to the point that they gave him a peace prize that he hadn't even taken power. These things have become political entities, they've lost their legitimacy. The United Nations sat there and watched a genocide take place. And even though they actually had the power to do something about it, they refused to use the power at their disposal to do something about the genocide. And I'm talking about the UN General Assembly. These institutions have failed monstrously. And that's not just on an international level. Even if you go into the United States, the government knows that the Trump administration, A, shouldn't even have the power to do tariffs by himself. There's that. But two, they're watching the president murder people. Full stop. He's just murdering human beings. And Congress completely abdicates its responsibility to rein in the president. It just watches. When Donald Trump tried to overthrow the government, what did Mitch McConnell do? Mitch McConnell came out. He gave the speech effectively saying Donald Trump is guilty of sin, but he's not in office anymore, so oh well. So the speaker, the majority leader of the Senate, fully acknowledges that the president was trying to overthrow the government. But, #reasons, these institutions have utterly, completely, and abysmally failed. We are in the law of the jungle. And people need to wrap their head around that, regardless of what that means. There is no law in a sense. There is nothing that would save you. Countries do what they do. And when they do what they do, either countries get involved or they don't. Now, if you're dealing with something under nuclear power, those countries will most likely not get involved because they don't necessarily want to start a nuclear war, meaning you have countries that have unilateral power and inclination to do whatever they want on the global stage. Now, we will see what that ultimately means. There are two forces pushing at this. The US and Europe, who demands the unilateral right to do whatever the hell they want on the global stage, and will wrap themselves in sanctimonious, self-righteous rhetoric in order to justify it, that only they believe, in the sense of them talking to themselves. But the other opposing force to this is countries like China, Russia, India, Brazil, etc., that are advocating, in a silent sense, maybe not silent sense, but advocating for this idea of international law, some kind of global order. Who wins this? And does this bring us to a precipice of the third war? Because ultimately, one of these sides is going to have to win out. And you may very well get a hegemon that oversteps and ends up in a world of hurt. The thing is that even a hegemon can't really win a war in this way. The moment that both countries get to be sufficiently, let's say, lethal, even if your lethality is a bit more than mine, if I'm lethal, we all die. And that disconnect seems to be there. Or maybe let's say it's not even a disconnect. It seems to be something that is turned into a negotiation. Meaning, how can I say this? They're using the fact that the world can end as a tool of negotiation, as a tool to pivot around. And so in the Ukraine war, Europe continues to act as if Russia is not a nuclear power, or that if Russia is pushed to a certain extent, that they won't end the world. That is an amazing thing. Russia is not on the border of Texas. You're getting a situation where Europe And the United States is encroaching closer and closer to Russia. And of course, there's no international body that calls that out. They just look at it and allow that stuff to take place. We are in the law of the jungle. It is terrifying. That is a terrifying place to be. But that's where we are. The other story, I want to hear what time is it? It could be up time. I want to show you something that is pretty amazing. Take a look at this. Take a look at this stadium, for one. This is in New York. This is a mayoral race. This is for mayor. This is for mayor. This is not somebody running for president. This is not somebody running for governor. Not somebody running for, I don't know, king of the world. This is just a mayoral race. Mandani. Look at that. That is amazing. That is amazing. Ted Rawl, when he was here, he pointed out that New Yorkers pay like $5,000 for rent. I nearly fell out of my chair when Ted Rawl told me that. That number is staggering. And you think to yourself, because oftentimes they would make the argument that, well, lefty can't really win. That the people who are pushing these particular politics can't, really get political power. That's just for mayor. And he's bringing tens of thousands of people, putting asses in seats. And I remember when Sanders ran, and I am not one of those people that don't believe that Sanders couldn't have won. Sanders could have won that race. But sometimes people are put together in a way that they're the instincts that make them a lefty. And I mean a real lefty. I don't mean this, these fake Democrats. The instincts that make them a real lefty are also the same instincts that propel them to lose. If you're not willing to throw a punch, you're going to lose. Now, in this race, Mandani ate Cuomo alive and brought up all of his failings in a way that Sanders would have never did. Bringing up, Cuomo is paying more than I want to pay, paying more for sexual abuse victims, meaning using more of New York's money to pay off sexual abusers, or the fact that he sexual harassed all these women more than I want to pay for food for grocery stores. Like, he was hitting Cuomo hard on this stuff, and he had no issue. He kept hitting him over and over and over again, just humiliating Cuomo on this. This crowd is there because the politics goes beyond the basic politics. I know people laugh at Marianne Williamson, but there's a part of what she's saying that's right. Politics needs more than just raw political calculation. There's a spiritual element in our politics that is missing. I don't mean this in a woo-woo sense. I mean this in a sense of very basic point of government. If you're not taking care of the public, then what is the point? Of course, there's defense and all this other stuff. But if your public is paying $5,000 for rent, if you have people who are living on the streets, if your subways are in squalor, if your city is falling apart, you're doing something wrong. When you get a guy who calls himself a socialist, who's a Muslim no less, has a gorgeous wife, very gorgeous wife, looks good himself, and he is giving a message saying, we can do better. We can be better. We can feed people. We can house people. This doesn't have to be in the way that it is. This doesn't have to be a race to the bottom. We can do better. The public responds. Oftentimes, what the Democrats get wrong, and they get it wrong for various reasons, but what they get wrong is that the issue is not messaging. The issue is not rando person coming out pretending to be Obama. It's not that. It's that they failed on a massive effing level due to the very basic things that they were supposed to do. That people like Sanders, who they claim to be for the last 50 years, they showed themselves that they weren't that person. In which case, woke policies, trans surgeries for kids, getting your proper pronouns correct, getting not dealing with the issues of workers' rights, not dealing with the basic things that people require in regards to things that would change their lives or make their lives better. For example, the childhood tax credit was a good example. You put money in people's pockets, and you put money in people's pockets in a way that they felt that was real. Hey, I'm getting a Social Security check for my child that is going to be a benefit to me raising that child, which, growing up poor, that would have been a big help for my family, for my mom and I, single parent. And what happens within a year, up in smoke. So you do something that you argue cut child poverty by 50%. And then within a year, you get rid of it. Your party got rid of it. You failed on basic things. And I'm saying basic things in a sense of actually doing things that are a benefit to the American public in a way where they can attribute to. They did that. Democratic Party put money in my pocket. They helped me raise my kid in this way. That went away. What Democrats require is a come to Jesus moment, an honest come to Jesus moment. We failed. We effed up. We got this entirely wrong. We were not working to the benefit and the interests of the public, and we apologize for doing so. So going forward, these are the things that we are going to push for. We are going to burn ourselves alive in order to get XYZ accomplished. Here are 3 items. These are the 3 items that we have on the marquee that we are going to get done. Period. That will not happen. I have no expectation of that happening. And I suspect part of the reason that Mondani is doing so well is because he doesn't come across as a Democrat, one, and many of the Democrats within the context of the, let's say, the infrastructure of the party hated that guy. The public knew that they hated that guy. And because the public hates the Democratic Party in general, he gets more credibility because of it. Hakeem Jeffries not recommending Mondani doesn't hurt Mondani. It only helps him. If Hillary Clinton came out and says, Mondani is great, his polling would have dropped immediately. It's the ostracizing the thing on some level that assists him, doesn't hurt him. The party is hated. And because that party is hated, if they all of a sudden gave their support, it makes him look less relevant and less serious. So when he comes out, he gives a strong socialist message in regards to this is what I want to do for New York. The public responds favorably to it because of the immiseration of that particular public in New York and what that public has been going through. And that's just New York City. That's not even New York State. And so there's something, I guess, positive about that the public is willing to be receptive to that message. That's a good thing. A lot of this stuff is going to depend on what Mondani does when he gets in office. And if indeed he can accomplish what he said he was going to accomplish. If he can't, it will set lefties back 10 years. If he can, it will be a positive in going forward. Again, this is only a mayoral race. I mean, you look at this crowd, and for a race for mayor, the crowd is astonishing. I mean, look at this. I mean, when Sanders was doing events for president of the United States, he was getting crowds like this. This is just a mayor race.
It is so good to see you all here tonight. I speak the language of democratic socialism only because he spoke it first. And when I
I know. I know. Just looking at the comments, I know a lot of you are like, that guy is so full of shit. I know you're thinking that. And I know in your mind, you're thinking to yourself, that guy's so full of shit. I have to be honest, I'm in a mood. I'm in a mood. I've been in a mood for a while, for several months. Especially watching the genocide take place. It has made me very dark in my point of view of this stuff. But I know I'm in a mood. And because I know I'm in a mood, I'm trying to fight that and try to give the benefit of the doubt. He's just a mayor, right? Like, his capability of doing stuff in New York is somewhat limited by what takes place in Albany. But he seems to be a true believer. I don't live in New York. That is going to be an issue for New Yorkers. And we'll see. I want to fight my cynicism on this and see and let him do what he do and see what happens to go from there. But I know a lot of you. Oh, one last thing before Mark is here. I want to talk about Nepal. I had a conversation with a gentleman here, and him and I got talking about when he found out what I did for a living. I was like, I do a political channel. I hesitate to tell people in person that, because you never know the politics of the person, and well, it's besides the point. I got into a conversation with the guy after I told him what I did, and he said, "So what do you think of Nepal?" and it's like, "What did you think about the protests?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was watching it, I was paying attention to it," and I pointed out, I said, "Look, two things from my point of view took place. One, the United States obviously had its fingerprints on a lot of that stuff. The United States had fingerprints on all sorts of things that were taking place around China. And Nepal seemed to be one of those places with USAID, or let's say other organizations that were backed by the US, putting money into Nepal in the protests. Two, the anger was real. Now, I have had the bizarre distinction of being here near two different, I don't know, what do you want to call it, revolutions? We'll call it a revolution, a shorthand. The first time was 18 years ago. During that time when I first jumped into the country, I did not know politically what was taking place in Nepal. I just ended up in Nepal because I was just the way the trip was going. My host at the time, I was in a hotel. They used to have rolling blackouts. So for 3 hours a day, the lights would be out 18 years ago. And I didn't realize that. I woke up, lights were out. What the hell? I go downstairs and he's just chilling outside in the back in the patio. He's like, "Oh, come on in, get some coffee or something like that. The lights will be out for a few hours." And as we started talking, he told me effectively the king was murdered by his brother. Because the king was murdered by his brother, the brother became the king. And because he's the king, despite the fact that everybody knows that the brother killed him, he's the king. Now, that king, at that moment, after being in power for a while, was being deposed by parliament. And an ultimatum had been put out saying, "You need to leave." The country was on pins and needles because the country didn't necessarily know what the king was going to do. The king eventually left without a fight, in which case, parliamentary took over. From 18 years to now, or let's say at the time where the government was overthrown, the way he explained it was not much had changed. And so you go from a king that effectively raped the country to a government, but the government is not doing anything dramatically different. That government then decides, you know what? We need to pay ourselves more. We need more money. Because we need more money, we're going to extract that from the treasury and from the purse, which pissed people off. So it's like, okay, not only have our standards haven't sufficiently changed with the times, but now you're going to give yourselves more money. The anger was real. He explained to me that the government murdered 19 kids. And he said the kids were still wearing their school uniforms as they were murdered. This obviously created anger. Anger to the point where they started burning down buildings, burning down police stations, burning down government buildings, burning down homes of the various people that were connected to the government in some particular way. Meaning they weren't going after random stuff. They were going after specific items that belonged and were associated with the people that were responsible for what happened and what took place. Eventually, the police decided we are not going to shoot any more people, in which case the government has been denuded of its protectors. Now, the anger, as he was pointing out, was real. The anger was legit. Why they were protesting was legit. The question always boils down to, yeah, you may have the anger that's legitimate, but is anybody also paying for it? And is anybody influencing, making a conduit for the anger to be expressed in a way that pulls down and takes down the government? It was an interesting conversation in the way that he was explaining it that had taken place. And yeah, it was an interesting conversation. I guess my point is, it's not one or the other, it's both. It may very well be likely, Brian Beletic may actually be entirely right that the US has its fingerprints all over it for obvious reasons, right? If you look at Cambodia and Thailand, if you look at India and China, India and Pakistan, all of these countries that are just so happen to be around China and just so happen to be catching fire, it's a weird coincidence. But I don't think it's a coincidence at all. Any more than I think that, let's say, a conduit might have been made for what was an organic protest, or at the very least, let's say, helped along. Even America needs a hand. A new government is in place. And there's a question now of what is this new government going to do? And is this government going to deal with the way, let's say, in the failings of the previous government? And at this point, the government is just taken over. Who knows? There's also a question of, will the tenor towards, let's say, other political players change as a response to this new government being into play? Now, a lot of people make the assumption that, well, if the U.S. had anything to do with this new government coming into power, then obviously the politics of the government will change in some particular fashion. We don't know. Just going to wait and see. I would imagine that the people here are waiting to see what takes place politically, and if anything takes place politically that is going to be different than a previous iteration of the government. As he pointed out before, the old parliament took over from the king, and they effectively started doing the same thing that the king was doing. And now, with all of the anger, and let's be honest, righteous indignation at the old government, everybody, I guess, is wondering, what is this new government going to do? How are they going to accomplish the objectives that the previous government failed at? And that is going to be an interesting thing to watch and see. I guess I'm looking more so for, does the politics of the government change? Does it change tenor to, let's say, Russia or China or India or whatever? Does that? China had a Belt and Road Initiative that was taking place in Nepal. For example, does that change? If you think of what was taking place in Argentina, for example, Argentina was supposed to be part of BRICS. And the moment that Malay gets in, he pulls out. Will something similar like that happen to Nepal? Wait and see. I would say, though, it would be in Nepal's best interest to maintain those ties. But we'll see. We will see. It was an interesting conversation. I put it that way. Like, to have him explain, there was a fight that was taking place on social media when all of this was taking place. And you had a lot of accounts that were coming out of Nepal being very pissed off at people who were saying that this was somehow pushed by the US government. Because their argument was, dude, we have agency. This is not a situation where we are being pushed or maneuvered. We have righteous indignation at the way the government has effectively conducted itself. And you may have the trigger of them trying to give themselves more money for quote unquote housing allowance. But that was just a trigger for something where the bomb had already been set and packed a long time ago. Their point is, we have agency. This was not something that was effectively pushed. And that was what he argued. This wasn't pushed. We had agency. We decided to do this. We were pissed off. The government overstepped its place. They murdered these kids. We responded to the fact that they did this. And at that point, it was time for that government to go. They showed themselves to be incapable of leadership and incapable of maintaining a credible, legitimate, or let's say credible legitimacy. They had to go. It's an interesting duality in the way that we look at it from the U.S. Well, let's say from our political distinction who look at that stuff, well, we know that the U.S. has a hand in putting money into all sorts of groups and everything else that supports opposition groups. But there needs to be an acknowledgement, even in that context, even if that's true, that the anger and everything else was completely legit. They were pissed. They had every right to be. So it is an interesting, it's interesting to hear somebody on the ground explain what took place, why it took place, and this wait to see what changes and if things change. It's also weird for me being here 18 years ago and being here now, arbitrarily, no less, during two political upheavals in the country itself as well. Nothing seems abnormal, if that's the case. Everything seems normal. Everybody is, well, people are people, right? They acclimate to that stuff pretty quickly. Give me 1 second. Okay. Mark is having a bit of trouble with his camera. He's restarting it. He will be here momentarily, so there's no point in going into another story. The Nepal thing's fascinating, though. Nepal thing's fascinating. Argentina are soft and lots of Zionist influence. Suede wine comfort stuff. I mean, dude, Malay needed what? 70, what, X number of billions of dollars, $20 billion or something from Trump. Then they won the election. It's like, how do you have a libertarian getting money from another state because his state is failing based on his own policies? That's amazing. And then his political party wins. That is breathtaking, right? How does that work? How do you need a $20 billion bailout? And then all of a sudden, we all die at the age of 70 anyways. Actually, not so much. Just with Flame, not so much. Trump is over 70. Joe Biden is over 70. Most Europeans live over 70. I mean, with the average age of, we die, 5 years younger than Europe? Not so much. That's not the average age, man. Who's going to bail us out after we implement some kind of Malay policies here? Nobody. The government is going to, look, our economy is made on dreams and duct tape. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the US economy, AI is the thing that is effectively keeping the economy afloat. But AI is a bubble. All of this money that goes into the United States, you have, let's say, you have the economic sector and the industrial output as one level. And then you have all of this money leveraged on top of it. That is just bets and gambles. There was a dot-com bust. I don't think we learned our lesson from the dot-com bust. And if AI goes belly up, that is going to be a disaster. That is going to be a complete and utter disaster. Kevin Wayne, good show, Jamal. What is this? Good show, Jamal. Jamalcational. Go ahead, Mark's back. Yeah, Mark's back. Well, thank you, Charles. Thank you. I appreciate that. I got to be honest. I don't like carrying the show on my own. I hate doing it. If I have a specific story that I want to hit, fair enough. But the main stories today have to do with the Venezuela issue and Trump. Venezuela and Russia. Russia on a few fronts. Pokrovsk and Kupyanks being surrounded but also the new missile. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it without looking at it. Berezvnik. It means Stormbringer. Those are the two main stories. And so, there's another story to hit with Trump being in China, but I'm going to hit that tomorrow with Warwick. So there's that. Oh, Mark is here. Excellent. Let's see. He was having a bit of trouble with his camera. Let's see if he is working. Okay, he's loading. Come on. You can do it, Mark. You can do it. I believe in you, Mark. I believe in you, Mark. Come on, Mark. Come on. Okay. Let's remove Mark until Mark's camera gets straight. He's having a bit of trouble. Okay, Mark will be on the show. He's having a bit of trouble. He's getting his camera resolved. Those could be a pain. So I feel his pain on this. Yeah, man, that missile having the capacity to effectively go around the globe. Putin asked him, how long did that missile stay in the air? And I forget how long he said, but it was like hours. That thing, 15 hours. That missile stayed in there 15 hours. And it covered 14,000 kilometers. And he pointed out to him, he said, that is not the limits of the missile in the sense of how far the missile can go. Okay, when Mark comes on, yeah, he's having trouble with his camera. Come on. Mark, can you hear me? Okay, you can't hear me. Okay. The way that they made that missile work was they use a nuclear power, I guess they use a nuclear power engine, like a small nuclear power device that would allow it to effectively fly for as long as they wanted the thing to fly. That's amazing. I mean, it's a nuclear missile using a nuclear power device in order to keep it flying in the air. So the idea that that thing could hit anything, and to make it even wilder, they pointed out that it can evade air defense. Like it's so wild how air defense, look, air defense is obviously important, right? But what does air defense mean when you can launch 1,000 missiles at somebody? Or you launch 1,000 missiles with a certain number of those missiles being evasive? Meaning your first salvos are there in order to drain. It's kind of like it's like shields in Star Trek. So many people don't know this, but because I'm a geek and I love Star Trek, the entire point of phasers is to drain the shields. You attack a ship over and over again with phasers. You drain the shields. When the shields are down, you then attack with larger weapons. Now, of course, you can hit with the larger weapons in the beginning, but it's almost like that. When Iran was fighting Israel, for example, many of the missiles that Iran shot at Israel were basically their old inventory. And so you spend all of this money, for all intents and purposes, using your air defense to shoot down old inventory. Your air defense gets drained because you can't produce those missiles because those missiles are so expensive in comparison to either the drones or the missiles that are being launched at you. And then they're like, all right, now we're going to use our good stuff. And we're going to use our good stuff to now hit your territory. That is, yeah, it's just wild. They're effectively now looking for how to implement this and put this into practice, into the military convention. And again, they're not doing this for hashtag reasons. They're doing this because I strongly suspect that they recognize that, or at the very least, they believe that a war may be coming. So, but before Mark comes on, and while he comes on, I want to show you something. This, can I even show this? Yeah, I don't know if I can show this. I'll make a ding for this. It was a video. There's a 4-minute video of Gaza and what it looks like. By the way, I pointed out that soldiers were at the food banks. And as I pointed out before, it's not just troops, regular people at food banks. This is Merlin. All of these people are out there trying to get food. That is a monstrous failure. This is taking place in Merlin. You can imagine this is going to be replicated in other countries, in other states also. Yeah. That's a disaster. That is a disaster. Let's go to the chat for a bit. Trump and Putin are good friends. Yeah. Okay. At the Alaska meeting, in secret, agreed to continue the war and extend Europe so that they can exhaust the funds of the Zionist oligarchs. Yeah, I don't buy that. There he is. There he is. There he was. There he was. Mark, can you hear me? Bobby Fischer is not the greatest chess player. There you are. How you doing, Mark? Can you hear me? His mic is off. Okay, Mark is having a lot of difficulty with that camera. Yeah, Mark is having a lot of difficulty with the camera. I have firm and complete faith that Mark is going to work that out. He has my infinite confidence. Okay. I hear him again. I see him. Mark, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
There you are. Yeah, I'm sorry you're having trouble with the camera.
Yeah, my apologies. I don't know whether it's my camera or StreamYard or I'm just a Luddite.
Don't apologize. That stuff happens. Technical issues take place. It's just kind of part of the job. But thank you for joining me. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can find Mark on Boosty, Boosty, under Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. Mark has also been putting out videos on YouTube, so badass on that. How you doing, man? You doing okay today?
I'm better now. I'm alive. Thanks. Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
It is always an honor and a pleasure to have you, Mark. So I guess there are two big issues. One, Kupyanks and Pokrovsk are surrounded. Anytime you see Putin in camo, you know something has hit the fan. He was having a conversation with Gerasimov at the command center, and they released the new missile or information about the new missile, nuclear-powered missile that can effectively travel anywhere around the world. But he also announced that Pokrovsk, and I may be pronouncing it wrong, but Pokrovsk and Kupyanks were surrounded. He pointed out that there were 31 battalions of troops that were surrounded in those regions. That is amazing. What's going on here?
Yeah, okay. I think we've been working towards this for a long time because we've been talking for several months now about the growing, first operational encirclement and now nearly complete physical encirclement of these two urban, heavily defended urban stronghold areas. Pokrovsk in the south central Donbass, formerly an important transport and logistics center, and Kupyansk in southern Kharkov, which Russia actually held in the beginning of the war and then had to withdraw from in the autumn of 2022 after, it was kind of bad planning, I guess, on Russia's part. They began the intervention in Ukraine with a relatively small force, less than 150,000, far smaller actually than the Kiev regime's military at the time. And they believed that they were forcing a diplomatic settlement, the Minsk protocols. But Kiev was just stringing them along while they got Western weapons into the country and while they rapidly mobilized large numbers of forces. And for whatever reason, Russia had not begun their own mobilization. And suddenly Ukrainian forces within a few months vastly outnumbered Russian forces, and they needed to withdraw from Kherson City and from Kharkov in order to shorten their defensive lines. And they began their brief own mobilization. They mobilized 300,000 reservists, and by then they got their volunteer contract recruitment program up and running, and they haven't had to mobilize any reservists since then, because they've gotten plenty of volunteer soldiers signing up in ever increasing numbers for the special military operation, through a combination of Russians believing in what they're doing in Ukraine, but also, of course, the good pay and benefits being offered doesn't hurt much either. So now they're back in Kupyansk, and this will really open up southern Kharkov region, and it will pave the way. Russian forces are already moving on Liman, and then which is only a couple of weeks behind Kupiansk at this point in military terms of the threat they're facing, of the crisis that the Kiev regime forces are facing there. And then Izium, a smaller area but important, and that is rapidly talked about as the gateway to Slavyansk, right? And everything now is, once Pokrovsk and Seversk in the North Donbass are wrapped up in the next few weeks, as seems likely, then everything will be about the Kiev regime's last defensive line. We've talked about it for a long time, the Slavyansk, Konstantinovka line. But Russian forces will then be in a position to move on it from 3 different directions, and their militaries will, at this point, are extremely heavily attrited in terms of both manpower and equipment and munitions. And the Kiev regime's military is getting weaker and smaller every day, and the Russian military is actually getting bigger and stronger in terms of equipment and experience every day. So it's really becoming extremely uneven and lopsided at this point. And what's happening in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk shows it. So when they say 31 battalion, these are, first of all, they're not full strength battalions. It must be said. The Kiev regime does not have full strength battalions, right? If a full strength battalion is supposed to be 800 people, a Kiev regime battalion is typically less than 50% staffed. So we're talking 300 to 400 people. Wow. Still, the numbers, the numbers that we're given is roughly 10,000 or 10,500 troops between the 2 locations, 5,500 in Pokrovsk and another 5,000 in Kupiansk, that are in threat at this moment of encirclement. And in fact, in Pokrovsk, the Russian military gave the remaining forces encircled in Pokrovsk a 3-day deadline, which expires about today, or face, in military terms, eradication. Although Putin has made clear that that Russia is hoping these forces will surrender, and they understand that it's difficult because the Kiev regime has a habit of killing its own forces who try to surrender with, shooting them in the back or drones. I've seen so many videos of troops trying to surrender being hit by their own drones. As long as they surrender and put down their arms, they will be treated according, as prisoners of war, according to the Geneva Conventions. Yeah. But it must be said that ideally, in an ideal world, the Kiev regime's military and political leadership, Syrskyi and Zelensky, would recognize that they waited too long to withdraw these forces in a bad situation. They should have made a tactical withdrawal to a better defensive position long ago, but for political and ideological reasons, they refused to do that. And now these men are trapped, and they ideally should order them to lay down their arms and surrender, because their position is hopeless. They cannot be reinforced. They cannot be resupplied. They can't get medical evac. They are put in an impossible position, and they're basically just being told, sacrifice your lives to gain us another week, another few days, which is not really acceptable. But we haven't come to expect anything less. The only time the Zelensky has ever ordered Ukrainian troops to surrender is when they already were surrendering, as Mariupol and at Avdiivka, when the forces were breaking, and in order to make it look like they were still in control of the situation, Zelensky post facto ordered a surrender or a retreat when they already were. So it's a very bad situation for them. And right now, what is happening in Pokrovsk and Kupyanks is eventually cleanup operations, mopping up operations. That's what it is. And that may take another few weeks, another month, but I mean, it's done at this point. And it must be said that the settlements of Seversk and Konstantinovka and Liman are in very similar situations. We've talked about these places multiple times before. And in terms of the timing, they're only a few weeks from being where Pokrovsk and Kupyansk are now. So it is highly likely that all 5 of these settlements, these strongholds, varying in size from towns to small cities. But what's important is that they were fortified and defended tooth and nail as strategic positions by the Kiev regime, and they've held out for varying lengths of time. Seversk has held out essentially since the beginning of the conflict. That one was a particularly tough night. Russian forces have thrown themselves at Seversk repeatedly, and this time they went wide around. They took over the long, tedious of taking out the Serebranka forest to the north of it that the Kiev regime had long operated out of. They made very good use of the forests and the foliage to hide from Russian artillery and drones, and to launch their own drones from. And anyway, it was a long, bloody battle for Seversk. The geography is unfavorable, but eventually Russian forces have now essentially operationally encircled and are moving towards a full encirclement of Seversk as well. In fact, in Seversk's situation, the Kiev regime forces are very soon going to find themselves very far behind the front lines, with no avenue of escape there either as well. So the Kiev regime's leadership, of course, is really refuses to accept the situation or to acknowledge it. The most we've heard is Zelensky admit in a brief couple sentence remark over the weekend that the Kiev regime forces there are in a very bad situation, and it's like, yeah, no,
That's an understatement.
Yeah, it's an understatement, and the Kiev regime does just not have the manpower left at this point to take the loss of another 10,000 troops in situations where they're obviously not going to get a very good kill ratio. Not that they have been so far. I don't know if you saw the video with James Corden over the last week, a former State Department official and advisor on Ukraine. He did an interview with Sky News Australia, actually.
I did see that interview. I have the clip for it. Yeah.
He was asked, about the situation, and he threw the reporters' propaganda back in their face and said it's exactly the opposite, right? Russian forces aren't exhausted. Russian forces aren't anything. Russian forces are strong and getting stronger. And he ascertained that the kill ratio was 36-1 in Russia's favor. And I was floored, right? Because I find it hard to believe that number. I can believe that in certain situations it reaches 8-1 or 10-1 even, but 36-1? I mean, wow.
I don't know where he got that number from. I was wondering where he got it from myself.
I have to say that still, without some kind of corroboration, I don't believe that number, but I can't completely discount it either, because he is a serious individual. He's not a pro-Russian, propagandist or even enthusiast or whatever. And anyway, I think we can ascertain that the kill ratio is now simply absurd. And the Russian forces are, progressing at the pace that they are with a war of attrition, only to keep their own casualties down so long that that they can keep this conflict up indefinitely if necessary. If at some point down the road NATO joins directly, I think that's always been a consideration by them, and we see the hysteria even now. I mean, when you come down to it, Russia is still finishing up Donbass. I mean, Pokrovsk is only some 30 kilometers from Donetsk city, right, where this all started out. And you hear the desperation in the hysteria in the West right now, with, being willing to at least consider, even if for the moment they have put aside the possibility of transferring Tomahawks, which was always problematic with launchers and U.S. personnel being needed and everything. But we saw the resumption of Storm Shadow strikes deep within Russia. And just over the weekend, U.S. forces in Ukraine, Trump was striking a dam in Belgorod, a reservoir dam that would cause, it's already causing some flooding, but if it is completely destroyed, then I mean, there's no military utility to it, right? It's simply spite, lashing out because their forces are so in such a desperate situation. It would only cause, the loss of lives of civilians and damage to civilian, infrastructure, buildings, homes, that sort of thing. And HIMARS we've seen that repeatedly, and we know from New York Times reports that every HIMARS strike cannot occur without the targeting, the guidance data, the satellite data, and the green light from the U.S. Every single HIMARS strike. We're not even talking ATACMS, right? We're just talking a regular using a guided launch missile. And that means that Trump, for all intents and purposes, is lashing out by hitting a dam in the Belgorod region to this situation. And, Russians don't like that. But ultimately, it is desperation. There's nothing else to say about that. And the fact that they resort to this is another sign of why Russia cannot let this regime stay in power at the end of this conflict, that they need to remove this entire regime and remove U.S. influence from U.S. and European influence from Ukraine in its entirety, because there can't be any settlement with that.
I would like to point out that I think it was several weeks ago that you and I were talking, and I said the map looked as if there was a mass encirclement that was taking place. Now, it may not have been a mass encirclement, but it did. But as you point out, all of these areas seem to be falling within like back
Yes.
to back, back to back.
Yeah. No, what you were talking about is a complete encirclement. You were talking a physical encirclement of everything, of the entire defensive line. And I pointed out that the manpower requirements for that would simply be prohibitive. And I told you that an operational encirclement of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk was possible at some point down the road if supply lines were cut, but that area was so big that even with Russia's advantage, that the manpower requirements, and what we're seeing is not one big encirclement, but now we're seeing each of these urban areas being first flanked in pincher movements, and eventually having their supply lines first operationally cut. And now in both of these cases, they're facing actual physical encirclement. But the manpower requirements from that are considerably less than encircling the entirety of the Donbass with troops. So
it's not like a World War II.
I mean, simply the militaries involved are not of that scale. And it must be said, whatever there's so much Western propaganda about Russian troops and Russian losses, from the very beginning, fighting with shovels, running out of this, running out of that, no morale, no training, right? Lives thrown away in what do they call it? Human wave attacks.
Right.
All of it could not be further from the truth. The Russian, the Kremlin is extremely concerned with minimizing Russian casualties, right? They said again, Putin said again over this weekend, no artificial timelines, right? No political deadlines, right? The goal is the destruction of the Kiev regime's military first and priority, but that Russian troop losses must be minimized. And that is to keep the support of Russian society, the morale of the Russian forces up. And yes, it's slow and grinding and methodical, but there's also no answer to it. And I understand there is a great deal of frustration from a certain segment of Russian sympathizers in the West that believe that it's simply not going fast enough for their Hollywood expectations and their Call of Duty experience.
To be fair to them, because I've spoken to some of them. I haven't had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Rowe, but I have spoken to some people who it's not about the Hollywood thing. From their point of view, they're looking at it as a black swan event, as you would call it. Meaning, the longer that this goes on, the more opportunity there are for either false flags, the more opportunity there is for something to take place. Meaning, yes, I think you're right that Putin is concerned about loss of life, but I think they're also concerned. Medvedev, in fact, pointed out when the Budapest summit fell apart, Medvedev gave a very long statement. And in the statement, he pointed out, he says, well, now that negotiations are over with, we can go after various people who are in, let's say, secretive hideouts that we want to go after. Okay, well, that kind of implies that part of Russia's rationale for also with this kind of war of attrition without going, let's say, heavier in Ukraine to try to end the war faster had to do with also wanting negotiations. I mean, it could be a combination of both, I suppose, but that's according to Medvedev.
Yeah.
It
has to be said, we haven't seen that yet. I mean, again, the argument there is removing the Kiev regime's political leadership. Let's say that we know that the Kiev regime has tried multiple times, according to Budanov, right? The Kiev regime's, genocidal, I like the dark military intelligence chief. He said several times they've tried to kill Putin. They just have never succeeded, right? So why doesn't Russia return? And that's simply because Zelensky is an ineffective and incompetent clown. And Syrskyi is only, one step removed from that and has his position simply because he is 100% politically loyal to Zelensky and clicks his boots and jumps how high when Zelensky asks how much. And as far as the Russian side is concerned, that if they took these people out, they would just be replaced, right? It is a regime. It is not a handful of individuals, right? I mean, I know the U.S. loves to believe and portray every crisis situation in the world as the resort of one demonized individual, be that Putin or Gaddafi or Hussein or Assad or anything like that. The cartoon puerile vision, American vision of the way the world works. Well, Russia recognizes that's not the way the world works, and taking out Zelensky and Syrskyi would threaten, replacing them with someone more competent and capable than they are, which is not that hard to up the bar in them. And I really do believe that's the reason why they haven't taken them out, simply because they would put someone more capable in that office. They're quite happy with Zelensky's insanity and even intransigence, because there are certainly some people within the Kremlin that believe the opposite, that the greatest opportunity for a black swan event would occur with Russian casualties climbing to a much higher degree through pushing it too fast, and that might provoke a Western response, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas by moving incrementally and methodically, that is the equivalent of a normal Western tactic that is called salami slicing or incrementalism. And as long as they keep turning the heat on the pot up slowly, that the frog that is the West will not notice it until all of Ukraine is done. That's a counter argument that I'm sure is being presented in one form or another in the Kremlin, and that ultimately is what they have gone with. That being said, with the crumbling that we're seeing at the Kiev regime, inevitably the Russian military is now moving faster than they were 3 months ago, than they were 6 months ago, than they were a year ago, and that pace is only going to increase. Now, obviously, it still won't be fast enough for some people. And I certainly have had my criticisms with the Russian military, over the course of, since 2014, and the choice, which Putin has admitted was a mistake, of not sending Russian troops in back in 2014, 2015. Of believing that there was the possibility of political reconciliation with, the Kiev regime, but primarily the West. And he's admitted that. And also, when the Russian intervention first began, I immediately, once I realized how small the Russian intervention force was, I said, mistake, mistake, mistake. Sure enough, it appears that it was, unfortunately, that it ended up so. But I am certainly not going to armchair quarterback around what the Russian Ministry of Defense is doing. Their slow and steady wins the race is winning. It has depleted, it has demilitarized much of NATO's military potential, right? Certainly in the capabilities of a land-centric war, right? They've simply exhausted artillery shells, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, everything. But more than that, there's also a diplomatic and a narrative value to all of this. By playing the game the way it's being played, that keeps the rest of the world outside of the West on side. At the very least, not on the West side. They see Russia as acting professionally, and Putin as acting as a statesman at every step in this process, right? And we may get frustrated when he treats diplomatically with Trump, and I certainly do, but I also recognize that he seems like he's the only adult in the room for one reason, because he's the only adult in the room, and I put myself in that category sometimes. So
Yeah, I don't know how he does it. I
yeah.
swear, man, I don't know how he does it. I would. Those are not my instincts. My instincts would be
And
wrong. But
it must be said, it's not just Trump. I mean, Putin treats every world leader that way, right? That is the behavior, the political culture that Putin has asserted. You can say it draws from the Soviet Union, and I think there's a degree of truth there. But even Macron, whom it is quite obvious that Putin really despises, has utter contempt for, he still couches his barbs at Macron in varying degrees and layers of civility and smiles as he does so. You have to really know Putin to know what is underneath that, and that is simply behavior. For everything else, there's Medvedev, right? And before Medvedev, it was Zhirinovsky. But now that Zhirinovsky has left us, and many people in Russia are going back over many of his videos, his claims, his predictions. Of course, they always cherry pick the ones that were the ones
accurate.
That came through, rather than all of the other clownish stuff he said as a Russian. I think it's fair. I mean, he wasn't necessarily so much in the ethnic terminology, but he was a Russian nationalist of the highest degree. And now it has, whether it has been decided to rebrand Medvedev or whether he has had a Damascene conversion along the way from his previous flirtation with the West when he was Russian president for 4 years and so on, 5 years actually. Anyway, he's the bad cop. He's the designated anger management translator, and what he says is not necessarily the Kremlin's official position, but is often indicative of the arguments that are occurring within the Russian Security Council, shall we say, of the extreme end of that. And I believe there's a purpose to, it's not incidental that Medvedev says this stuff. He's putting out a Russian maximalist position that is not only for the Russian domestic political audience, but it is for the Western political elite. So to know where Russia could take things if they don't, have some type of self-reflection and a return to sanity, which they frankly don't appear capable of. So
yeah, I take Medvedev as being an honest voice. I just take him as, it's I don't believe for a moment that Medvedev is a rogue actor or random. I take it's not like he's saying something that's different. I mean, Putin may have put it in different political language, but Medvedev just, he sounds like this is what they're really thinking. Putin is couching it in certain language, but this is what they're really thinking. That's why I always take Medvedev.
And again, part of that is the Russian president will remain professional in all ways, in all rhetoric, all circumstances. But that is not the requirement of the deputy chair of the National Security Council. And if you still want to consider him, there's still no one who represents Putin's wingman and understudy. Whether Medvedev ultimately succeeds Putin or not, he's still Putin's wingman. I mean, that's perfectly clear, and still has, as deputy chair of the Security Council and head of the Russian military-industrial complex, well, at least portions of it, he still obviously has an incredibly important position right now.
When these locations fall, Kramatorsk, Kupyanks,
Konstantinovka,
right. When those fall and Kramatorsk is effectively alone, they are going to lose thousands of people just before they even get to Kramatorsk.
Yes.
Do they know, or do you have any idea of the defensive capability of Kramatorsk after losing all of these people? Like, it's one thing if they're supported by the various regions. I suppose that Russia went around and took out these regions in order to isolate Kramatorsk by
Yes.
itself as a singular
Yes.
thing.
So
Do they know? Wait, any idea how long it
yeah,
holds
I mean,
out?
they are heavily fortified. They've been fortified since 2015, right? And it's important to remember that actually the start of the Russian Spring, right, uprising against the Maidan that seized power in Kiev in 2014, that started in Slavyansk, right? That's where it all began. So they have heavily fortified that for a decade now. That being said, they've lost so many troops, and we keep hearing Western analytical reports. You know, if you look below the headlines and the rhetoric, and you have various Western institutions like the Kiel Institute in Germany, but others now who keep track of such things, that are saying that the amount of military aid to Ukraine from the West is continually going down. Right? That that number is on a long-term and significant downward trend. And you could argue that part of that is because Trump is no longer providing large military packages, and what does come from the U.S. is supposed to be paid for by the Europeans through the new Pearl program. But to a much more real extent, the real truth behind that is the West, including the United States, is simply out. They're tapped out. They don't have the weapons, right? We had this report from Trump, from the Pentagon earlier, from Elbridge Colby, talking about the critical shortage of air defense interceptor missiles, which I will still proclaim from the hills is the U.S. Achilles heel right now. Their air defense, their low production rate of air defense interceptor missiles, but also, you know, even standard offensive missiles, ATACMS, you know, everything. There are 12 missiles that the Pentagon has ordered the U.S. military industrial complex now to double or quadruple production of. And the reply from the military industrial complex is like, yeah, great, but we're going to need tens of billions of dollars of more investment before we can, you know, actually go about even the construction and years that would take to do that. But yeah, please, you know, let's go. Just give us the money. And the Pentagon, the reaction from the White House seemed to have been, well, we expected you to just magic it appear, you know, produce on demand, you know, that sort of thing. There's only very limited, very extremely limited progress, you know, in that regard. And for a strange reason, it seems that, you know, even if we're talking artillery shells, that you know, the facilities that they're setting up for artillery shell production in the U.S. and in various places in Europe, I mean, they just seem to be rushing things so much that they keep having explosions, and I can't say why. I guess they're just careless.
One last thing on this issue before moving over to the new missile. Once Kramatorsk falls, whenever that takes place or however long that takes place, at this point, there is no additional. The territory, or let's say the fortifications, are not extended beyond Kramatorsk, correct? Like that's
okay.
Once
there
fall,
was an attempt. There was an attempt to erect another defensive line in the Donbass, basically on the Donbass border, further back. But Russia has already penetrated that in the direction of the Dnipropetrovsk region, so south of Donbass, where Russian forces have already moved completely to the west and are now breaking in. Obviously, they're in the Dnipropetrovsk region at this point. They've broken clear through that, so it's not clear that defensive line is at all functional at this point. I mean, there is supposedly a position for the Kiev regime forces to fall back to. Now, whether that is actually true or not, we have seen repeatedly that the Kiev regime orders defensive positions built, you know, certainly during the last 2 or 3 years, and money is taken, and then they you know, throw some barbed wire on the ground and some dragon's teeth that aren't even dispersed or something like that, and there's a couple ditches and there's no real fortifications. And if that's, I can't say whether that's actually the case in this for the entirety of this supposedly, invested in defensive line past Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, but I don't have any faith that there is any real defensive line after Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. I tend to be extremely suspicious of any claims that is true.
So that's just open
again,
step.
We see that Russian forces are already moving into the steppe in the Dnepropetrovsk region, right? To the west of what was the front in south central Donbass for Sleboda and Karakhova, right? While part of the Russian forces moved further up north to encircle Pokrovsk, some of them kept going west, right? There's now a Dnepropetrovsk front. And the same thing in the Zaporozhye region. Russian forces are now, they're also going about the investment very heavily of a stronghold called the Malaya Tokmachka, which is, essentially a position protecting Arehov, which is the small city where the Kiev regime launched the ill-fated NATO 2023 offensive out of.
I see.
And after that, it would just be a straight line to Zaporozhye city and Dnepropetrovsk further up the line. Now, another thing that has been reported so much in the last 2 weeks that really can't be denied at this point, although it is not officially acknowledged by the government, by the ministries of defense of either side, but Russian forces are very active crossing the Dnieper. Right?
Yes, I saw that.
They are right now. It is mostly they're taking every last little island, including ones that connect directly, right, to the parts of Kherson City. The majority of it on the right bank, the west bank of the Dnieper River, and there are plenty of reports of Russian forces that have actually crossed the Dnieper, and it seems to be that they are suggesting that it is more than just DRG groups, right? That it is regular Russian infantry at this point.
So they've created a beachhead.
I would say they're creating a beachhead. They are creating a beachhead. They haven't created one yet. I believe that they are going about the creation of one. And there's two ways to look at this, and I believe that they are both valid, right? One is that this is a real move to take Kherson City. Or two, that this is largely a diversionary measure that is forcing the Kiev regime to keep some degree of troops in Kherson City, or possibly even move reinforcements there, right, to protect Kherson City from this. And I believe they're both true. Because this is the way the fluid nature of the Russian front works that I've talked about before. That is the way that the Russian military has gone about countering the problems of 24/7 satellite and drone reconnaissance, preventing the buildup, the critical mass of troops that is needed to make a large scale, particularly a maneuver offensive. And this is why Russian has focused more on, softening up from a distance, but then infiltration tactics rather than a big armored push and offensive. But they will continue these small boat optics, building up a critical mass of Russian forces, in the environs of Kherson City, until the Kiev regime moves enough reinforcements there to stop them. And if they don't, then Russia will exploit the situation and they will surge forces in and make a real offensive out of it. This is what Russia is doing all along the contact line, right? They are keeping their forces fluid and maneuverable and capable of pressuring the Kiev regime everywhere, And when inevitably it moved troops from one location to another to try to plug holes in the lines because of their manpower shortages, then Russia surges and exploits the situation in that now weakened area. And the way they're able to do this is because they now have enough manpower to do this, and because their logistics is so capable at this point. They fluid. The Russian front line is like water, right? Against the dam, looking for cracks, looking for seams, like has occurred around Pokrovsk and around Kupyansk and numerous other places now. And then the water surges and rushes in and widens those gaps and exploits the situation. But the fluidity of the forces, the maneuverability, is the way Russia is progressing on the offensive, despite the reality of, I don't know if you want to call it modern warfare or postmodern warfare, to signal there's a difference from what has come before. But when both sides have 24/7 satellite and drone reconnaissance, real-time information of the battlefield, and the threat of FPV drones, right, which now account for some 80% of Russian casualties, right? That is the way you deal with it, is by being fluid and maneuverable, keeping a limited amount of troops closest to the opponent. And the contact line is really not just about where troops are engaging in small arms against each other, because of the reality of drones and precision strikes and this reconnaissance. The contact line now really extends about 30 kilometers on both sides of the actual contact line. It's an expanded area of engagement because so much is long range strikes and drones at this point, right? Whether we're talking artillery, whether we're talking guided rockets, whether we're talking drones, FPV drones, strike drones like the Garan and the Lancet, loitering munitions, all of these sorts of things. And the Kiev regime has everything, practically the same on their side. They just have increasingly smaller amounts of it, right? So it's not that they have capability, right? And they still do have experienced troops that have fought, but the number of those experienced troops keeps shrinking as well. And they're filled with conscripts who have no training, no education, no battle experience. The Kiev regime's officers and NCO corps is just eviscerated at this point. They don't have enough trained, experienced people left. We've heard this directly from the commanders of some of these Azov and other battalions, saying, that they went into the whatever with 100 men, and now they've got 11 left, something like that. And everyone else is, as far as they're concerned, just meat puppets that have no real value to them.
Mark, you are awesome. A fantastic breakdown of what is taking place on the battlefield. This is a big deal. So thank you for the breakdown of this. Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Boosty, Boosty, under Real Politic with Mark Sleboda, or you can just put in his name. You can also find him on his YouTube channel. I've seen your videos that you've been putting out recently, so shout out to you for that. I've always, you best in the business. I don't take that back. I stand by that. Mark, thank you for this. You have a fantastic day, man. You have a good one.
You as well.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
All right. And I am running behind. Caleb, you have my deepest apologies. There is a time difference here that is not direct. So, like, for example, from my point of view, when I started the show, I started at 4:45. And so it doesn't have the clean hour. And so when I looked at the clock, I'm like, Caleb is here 15 minutes early. And actually, you were exactly on time. You have my deepest apologies for that. I'm still getting used to it. Welcome to the show, man.
Sure. Glad to be here. How you been?
I'm doing okay. Again, you have my apologies. I don't like keeping my guests waiting. And when I just so happened to say, what is the time in Virginia? It was like 9:22. I was like, God damn it. 9:20. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
Hey, it happened.
Yeah, I just don't like it to happen, but I'm sorry. It won't happen again. It won't happen again. Welcome to the show, man. Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin, just for the people to know, he is director for Center for. Wait a minute, give me 1 second. Caleb, we'll pull up everything. There we are. There we are. Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst. He is director for CPI, Center for Political Innovation. Caleb has written several books, and I always ask you the name of those books because I don't necessarily know if you put out a new book. You are a prolific writer. You write more than most people that I know. What is your latest book, just so the audience would know?
My latest book is Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story, kind of getting into the background of the neocon wing of the Republican Party, how some of those folks originated among the folks who broke with the Soviet Union, followers of Trotsky. Trotsky and the Neoconservatives. It's gotten quite a good review, around. People have read it and appreciate it.
Yeah. Is it because that title is fascinating, and that title is going to be fascinating to a lot of people? Because is it because Trotsky was more of an interventionist, and you get neocons who take on that same similar interventionist politics? Is that the connection between the two?
Trotsky very much incarnated a desire to spread chaos and instability all over the world, and that his radicalism, his attraction to communism was based on kind of an alienation from Russian society. He was very much in love with the Western left and its traditions. And when Stalin took the Soviet Union in the direction of building socialism in one country with a planned economy, rather than trying to have a global crusade to tear down every last king, and that wasn't of interest to Trotsky. And a lot of the intellectuals who had grouped around Marxism and Bolshevism left the communist movement with Trotsky because they were attracted to the notion of the permanent revolution. That was Trotsky's theory, the permanent revolution. And a lot of those folks then eventually broke with Trotsky, because Trotsky defended the Soviet Union and maintained the Soviet Union was still what he called a deformed workers' state. In 1939, in the lead up to World War II, they cut their ties with Trotsky and ultimately went into the U.S. camp. And post-World War II, a lot of them started working for the CIA. It's an interesting story, how one thing led to another, and now we have the foreign policy establishment in the United States of neoconservatism, many of whom went into the field of Sovietology and studied Russia and became like Russia experts from the point of view of opposing Russia, and set the stage for neoconservatism. And it's quite a long and interesting story of how they went from one to another, but it needs to be told, and it points to a lot of truths about Western political discourse and how confused and muddled things have gotten.
Wow. That is a fascinating breakdown. There's a guy who, this is not what I brought you on for, but just as an aside, there's a book, I think it's called The Two Eagles. And it talks about how after the Second World War, the United States brought in Germany, or Nazis for all intents and purposes, and used Nazis as a way of working out foreign policy and incorporating a lot of, basically was using Nazis as informants on the Soviet Union. So the perspective that the US was getting about the Soviet Union were coming effectively from Nazis, and how these people were pushed into the CIA. The CIA was protecting this band of Nazis that it was using to spy and to give it intel on the Soviet Union. Oh, it's fascinating, completely fascinating. Caleb, I brought you on to talk about Venezuela.
Okay.
It has become clear at this point that this is not a pressure campaign. This is a regime change war. This is a coup. Now, Trump is using this idea of, well, they can't really make up their mind. Maduro's a dictator. Maduro's illegitimate. They are using cocaine. They are putting in fentanyl. And they're going to come up with something else probably in a week or so in regards to why they're coming up with a justification for doing this. Dropsite News, this is Ryan Grimm's outlet, came out with this article that lays it bare, just lays it bare. U.S. intelligence has assessed that little to none of the fentanyl traffic to the United States is being produced in Venezuela, despite recent claims from Trump administration. A senior U.S. official directly familiar with the matter tells Dropsite. The official noted that many of the boats targeted for strikes by the Trump administration do not even have the requisite gasoline or motor capacity to reach the United States. Now, this was something that was obvious. Here is one of the pictures of them blowing up the boat. Take a look at the size of this boat, just for clarity of what we mean when we say these boats obviously are not going to the United States.
Venezuela and what
I don't want to play the sound for this because I'm going to get dinged if I do. But this is 60 Minutes doing a propaganda bit for the Trump administration, trying to justify the regime change war. That's a speedboat. That's just a speedboat. And the Trump administration is arguing that tiny boat is coming to the U.S. to bring fentanyl. And because of that, it allows the Trump administration to murder, 23 people in 7 strikes off the coast of the Caribbean. They are moving the drill forward to the area, to South America. And of course, they've been using Puerto Rico as this kind of staging base where they've been developing a huge amount of armaments and everything else. The article also makes the point of saying Guyana and Colombia are directly involved in this. Now, obviously, it's not the president. Gustavo Petro has been very angry about what's been taking place, especially since they've been murdering Colombians also. Give us the latest on this. What do you think is taking place here? I mean, are they really considering invading Venezuela in a regime change operation?
Well, I have been stating pretty consistently since this crisis began that there are 3 possible outcomes. The first is that we'll see a repeat of what happened in Trump's first term, which is that they will escalate, they will threaten, they will engage in provocations, and then they will move on, and then they will back down. That's what happened in Trump's first term, and that, for a while they had the food truck provocation. They were doing a lot of threats against Venezuela, and then they moved on. The second possibility is that we will see airstrikes from the United States targeting Venezuela, probably done under the guise of these false claims about, Venezuela being involved in the drug trade. And that would be a huge violation of international law. That would be a huge crime. It could, result in civilian casualties, and it would just be an awful thing. And that's the third possibility, or the second possibility. The third possibility would be that there would be a direct ground invasion of Venezuela. That third possibility is a nightmare scenario for the entire region, because you would be taking a very stable country with a strong central government, and you'd be casting it into chaos. And Colombia has already said it would send its forces to fight on the side of Venezuela. Russia and China support Venezuela. There are already loads of Chinese tanks in Venezuela. There are Chinese airplanes. The Wagner Group, Russian military forces are there. And it would be an absolute disaster if people are concerned about refugees and people fleeing, cause Venezuela's central government to fall and create instability. You're going to have a lot of refugees. If people are concerned about drug gangs having influence, right now, Venezuela is pretty inconsequential in the international drug trade, according to the writings and publications of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency of the United Nations. But if you were to destabilize the country, those kind of forces tend to set up shop when you have instability. That third option of an actual war to overthrow the Venezuelan government, that's a nightmare scenario for the world, and it would have catastrophic consequences for the whole region. And we here in the United States, which we're particularly close to Venezuela, I mean, it's just south of the border, right? I mean, it's in South America. That would certainly spill into America, and that's a lot of what Trump supporters don't like. They don't like drug gangs. They don't like refugees fleeing here. Well, you have a direct ground invasion of Venezuela, you're going to have a big problem with all those things. So my hope is that we're dealing with the first situation, that, Trump will give Marco Rubio the threats. He'll, this is appeasing that, particular faction of his administration, and that, they'll get the show they want. They'll get the threats they want, and then we can move on. But, the second and third options are very serious. The third one being the most frightening. It has been revealed there are disagreements within the Trump administration about this, that Marco Rubio and Wyckoff are strongly at odds about what to do about Venezuela. It appears that just this morning, Venezuela and Russia signed some kind of strategic partnership. And people are wondering if the stalling of U.S.-Russia negotiations is actually related to Venezuela. On Friday, I actually got to meet the Russian Direct Investment Fund CEO, who is in town.
Krylov.
Kirill Dmitriev. Yeah, and I got to meet
Kirill
him.
Dmitriev. Okay.
Yeah, and he was in town for a surprise meeting. You can go to my YouTube channel and you can watch. He spoke with us. I greeted him
That's very
outside his
cool.
hotel. Yeah, I was very excited, and it was a surprise visit. And then we saw he said he was in town to have a meeting with unnamed officials from the Trump administration. The main remarks that he made to me and Russian media that were greeting him was about this Bering Sea tunnel and how Elon Musk's technology has made it much more affordable. So then it was revealed Sunday that he was here to meet with Anna Paula Luna, who is a representative of Florida, a member of the U.S. Congress, and that's who met him. And they had a meeting to discuss it. And the meeting in Budapest that was supposed to take place, it wasn't canceled as much as it was postponed. So it's not clear what's going on. But, now there's this announcement that Venezuela and Russia have signed a military agreement. And I think that may be part of what, has the situation on hold. It's like, how is the USA supposed to make peace with Russia and end the war in Ukraine when Russia's very key ally in, this hemisphere, Venezuela, is facing the threat of a direct invasion? Maduro has called for international brigades of fighters to go to Venezuela to support them. The militias are on standby. I mean, it's like, you put Venezuela on the brink of war, you put all of South America kind of holding its breath to see what's going to happen. And how could Russia possibly just sit down and say, all right, let's end the Ukraine war? I mean, it's, you can't end one war when you're about to start another one. Right. I mean, we're going to have to see how this goes. This is an awful situation. This is absolutely awful. And to think that now we're in a situation where the U.S. government is actually shut down. There's questions about how many U.S. military servicemen are even going to get paid. People are about to lose their food stamps, food assistance. There's going to be a huge run on the food banks in the United States because November 1st, food assistance to low-income families is going to stop, and we're about to possibly open up a new war that will cost millions and millions and billions of dollars and will have catastrophic economic impact and refugees and all. I mean, this is awful. This is absolutely awful. And the USA needs to just de-escalate. As far as those ships, I have said from the beginning, if any of these ships were actually carrying drugs, they wouldn't have sunk them. They would have seized them as evidence to try and build the case for what the whole world knows is not the case, which is that Venezuela is not a drug country. I mean, they're just not. So if these ships actually had drugs on them, they would seize them and use them to try and build their very difficult case to make that Venezuela is a big problem in the drug trade. They're kind of trying to reenact the Reagan administration in some weird way, right? Reagan would attack countries in South and Central America on the grounds of them being part of the drug trade because it was the age of dare, right? Dare and, just say no and all of that. And that was part of the war on drugs in America was, military interventions in South and Central America in the name of opposing drugs. But we're not doing dare. We're legalizing marijuana. Marijuana is legal in almost quite a few U.S. states now. I mean, dare is, decades in the past. I remember it from when I was a kid in the 90s, but, most people, it's just a memory now. So, why are we threatening military interventions in the name of dare? I mean, this is weird. And then, so what it's cocaine, that they supposedly have, and then it's fentanyl they supposedly have. And it's just getting stupid. It's just getting stupider by the minute. And this is Marco Rubio getting appeased and getting his, appeasement, his favor from the Trump administration because he's part of, the Cuban exile community that has an axe to grind. And they're not really concerned about the long-term foreign policy interests of the United States. They just want, to overthrow a government in the region. They're at war with the Marxist governments of South and Central America. And this is a particular exile community that has been supportive of Trump. January 6th, they made a big deal about the Confederate flags in the crowd, and there were certainly some, but there were a load of other foreign flags among the January 6th protesters. There were loads of Miami Cubans that were bussed in. There were loads of right-wing Venezuelans. There were loads of flags of the Shah, the Iranian monarchy, the Persian monarchy. That lion, that flag, which is like a lion with a sword under it. And there were loads of Shah supporters who bussed in for the January 6th events, right? And that Trump has really made a big effort to, recruit all of these kind of foreign constituencies that want to go back to the homeland and overthrow the government. And that seems to be who he's trying to appease here.
Yeah, it's wild. It points out, it says Rubio's policy, because they're calling it, as you point out, Rubio seems to be the one that's running this. Rubio's policy was mostly recently at the crossroads when Maduro offered to turn over those oil resources to the United States in exchange for cessation of hostilities. The reporting that came out in the New York Times, I believe, was that Maduro offered Trump, says, look, I'll just give you the oil and let's just, leave me to my devices. Right here, it says Trump acknowledged the offer in a recent appearance when Trump pointed out Maduro doesn't want to, quote unquote, fuck around with us. Trump rejected the offer after being swayed by arguments by Rubio that the best way to secure Venezuela's oil reserves is to facilitate regime change in Venezuela and to make a better deal with the new government, effectively put in a puppet government and then rape Venezuela in regards to some kind of oil trade deal with the U.S. and obviously cutting out China in the process of doing so. So the goal of the Trump administration is regime change.
Yes.
Like, meaning it's not, okay, we're just going to pressure these guys. It seems that with the military arsenal that they're piling up, that they're not piling it up for no reason, that they're piling it up because they're going to use it. That's wild to me. And as you pointed out, the fact that the government is shut down and these guys, meaning the military is not getting paid. And they're still like, well, we're still going to use the military in order to kill a lot of Venezuelans and to try to topple the government of Maduro. That is an astonishing thing. That is an astonishing thing. What do you think the success, or let's say the consequence of this is going to be if indeed they go through with this?
Well, again, mass refugees, a big increase in the presence of drug cartels. It would be an absolute disaster if there was actually a invasion. Let's be clear, though. The policy of the United States has been to overthrow the government of Venezuela for decades, really since 2002 at least, probably earlier than that. I mean, Hugo Chavez was first elected in 1998. 2002 was when they had the coup where Hugo Chavez was arrested temporarily and removed from power and then brought back to power because of an uprising of rank and file soldiers. And since then, the United States has been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. And things really intensified in 2015 after the death of Hugo Chavez, when you had Maduro and then you had the Obama administration just amping up the sanctions. And I was in Venezuela in 2015 and I saw how difficult it was. But things in Venezuela in terms of, the food crisis and all that have really improved in the last several years. The last 3-4 years, things in Venezuela have gotten much better and the government is much stronger. And there have been many attempted coups. And again, if Maduro was going to, fall because of internal issues, that would have happened already. Maduro is quite strong at this point. He's been able to hold the country together through difficult times. And at this point, it looks like the USA is resorting to all-out threats. But again, I don't know that we're necessarily going to see a full-on invasion. We may. That is very possible at this point. We may see airstrikes, or we may see a de-escalation, and that the Trump administration may move on to another foreign policy theater. All of this is absolutely disastrous, and it is, not done in the interest of the American people. I will point out, though, that it fits a pattern, because there's all these reports of Maduro making offers to the United States and such. Well, the reason the USA is not accepting those offers, and it's not about getting Venezuela's oil. It's about driving Venezuela off the oil markets. That's the goal, right? Iraq, they were a major oil exporting country that was selling oil in competition with Wall Street and London, and they were blown to bits. And that created scarcity on the oil markets. And now people who used to buy their oil from Iraq are largely buying their oil, from American and, U.S. aligned exporters. And that Iraq's oil exports since the U.S. invasion have been roughly 10% of what they once were. And the same with Libya. Libya was the top oil exporting country in Africa. It was blown to bits. And now oil exports in Libya are down to like maybe 10%, 12% of what they once were. These countries, it's not like the USA goes there and gets their oil and starts selling their oil to make money off of it. It's that their oil just stops going out on the market. The country gets cast into chaos and instability. You get, the country is, different factions fighting for power, and the central state is overthrown. The infrastructure is blown to bits, and they stop selling oil, and then there's less oil on the market. So the price goes up, and the people who do then keep buying oil buy it from U.S. aligned people rather than the government that was there before. And that's how these oil wars tend to operate. When you talk about imperialism, we're talking about monopoly. There's people don't understand what imperialism is. Vladimir Lenin wrote his very, very important book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And he talked about imperialism is capitalism in its monopolistic stage. It's the export of capital, with the corporations being sent all over the world. Rather than selling products on the international market, the corporations themselves become exported. You can also read what was written by Henry Charles Carey about the English system, and he described, what was, the basis for maintaining slavery in the United States, and what Abraham Lincoln was fighting against was this English system of the big corporations dominating the world and centralizing wealth into one mighty city. And that was Henry Charles Carey, the economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln, wrote about this. And that imperialism is a system, and it is a system about maintaining a monopoly and holding back development in the impoverished countries of the world. That's the idea, is keeping Asia, Latin America, Africa, keeping them from developing their own industries, from selling their own resources and developing and building up their own economies, and keeping them under the domination of Western corporations. Classic example being when the British Empire went to India, they burned down all the textile looms and forced the people of India who'd been weaving and making their own cloth for thousands of years, forcing them to import their cloth from British corporations. You remember, what was Gandhi arrested for? He boiled salt water, right, and made his own salt. And why was that a crime? Well, the law in India was that salt, you had to buy salt from British, salt importing corporations. And so he boiled his own salt because he didn't want the British to have a monopoly on salt. And so he would sit in front of the police and boil his own salt, and then they would arrest him. That's imperialism. It's about, taking domination of an economy and forcing them to buy products from you. And that's, NAFTA is a great example. The people in Mexico have been, growing their own food for thousands of years. But now at this point, almost all the food in Mexico, you have to buy it from American corporations like Kraft, right? Because the farming sector of Mexico was destroyed by NAFTA, with the NAFTA agreement, right? And so it's the export of capital. It's kind of preventing countries from developing their own industries and having their own economy, and making them just kind of captive markets where big monopolies can dump their products. That's the economics of imperialism. And that one of the problems that I have and I see is that the left has gotten away from this economic understanding of what imperialism is. People think imperialism is the movie Avatar, right? The movie Avatar, where it's like there's these beautiful people that live in the woods and have no technology and are just so pure and untainted by the West. And then the evil colonizer comes and wants to bring in electricity and modern housing and all of that, and and the nature, the people, the beautiful primitive people team up with the spirits of the forest to fight against that. That's Hollywood. That has nothing to do with the economics of imperialism. Anti-imperialism is countries fighting against the big monopolies so that they can have power plants, so they can pave their roads, so they can electrify, they can wipe out illiteracy. And the countries that have broken out of imperialism, they're breaking out of imperialism because they want to build. That's what they're struggling to do. And I've been to Venezuela, and that's what the Venezuelan government has done. They've built. I walked through a neighborhood in central Caracas where every building was built by an interest-free loan provided by the Venezuelan government. And before that, people lived in shacks without running water and electricity. But because of the Bolivarian government taking control of the oil, using the oil revenue to subsidize the domestic economy, now all kinds of people have housing in central Caracas. The Venezuelan government wiped out illiteracy. There was a lot of illiteracy in Venezuela prior to Hugo Chavez, but they wiped out illiteracy. They brought in Cuban doctors and set up Cuban healthcare clinics all over Venezuela, and basically healthcare is free and provided by Cuban doctors. And they paved the roads. They enabled Venezuelans to start their own farms. And it's interesting because Venezuela's economy is largely centered around government-controlled oil resources, but they use that government oil revenue to then subsidize different businesses, a lot of which are worker cooperatives, but not all of them. Some of them are just regular private businesses. But it's the state that comes out of an anti-colonial revolution, emerged and took control of the oil resources, and then used the revenue to build up a new independent economy. And that's what the USA is trying to crush. And that when the oil prices were quite high before the 2014 oil dropped, Venezuela was doing amazing things. They were building housing in Honduras and Guatemala. They set up the ALBA Bank, the Bolivarian Alternative for Latin America Bank, and were subsidizing development throughout the region. And that is what the imperialists and Wall Street are really afraid of. They don't want an independent economy to emerge in Latin America. They want these countries as impoverished captive markets. And that's what we need to understand is going on here. This is a struggle for economic domination, and that the BRICS world represents a new economy that is based on growth. And what China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there are whole sections of the world that are building themselves up outside of the dominance of Wall Street. And that's what the imperialists and the big monopolies are fighting against. And that's what they're trying to do. They want to reduce these countries to impoverished captive markets and vassal states rather than strong independent economies. The struggle against imperialism is really the struggle against degrowth. When a country is overthrown by the United States, it's degrown. Instead of having a strong economy, instead of building itself up, it's reduced to chaos and rubble and instability, and that ensures the dominance of the monopolists. Imperialism is monopolistic capitalism.
So the goal is not to control the oil. The goal is effectively to destroy the ability for Venezuela to export its oil. Interesting.
Yeah, basically, to reduce Venezuela to chaos. Yeah.
Wow, I took it as the other way. I mean, because, I think Chevron is one of the main companies that work with Venezuela in regards to producing its oil. And my assumption was that they wanted to take over the oil in order to drop the price of oil in order to damage, let's say, Russia, for example, as one of the major oil exporters around the globe. But you're right. In the sense of Iraq, in the sense of Libya, it was the opposite. It was destroying the capability for those countries to actually produce their oil revenue, basically increasing the price of oil, in which case the United States is one of the major oil exporters around the world now. Wow. I did not know that, Caleb. You're right.
There you go.
You're absolutely right. When you were in Venezuela, what did you give me your experience when you were there? Because I don't have a sense of it. I've never been. It's like Maduro's a dictator. People are eating dog food. People are, meaning these are the things that people say. And by the way, they're saying the quiet part out loud at this point. This is Lindsey Graham, who is always looking for somewhere to overthrow, saying the quiet part out loud on TV, no less. Listen to this.
Military operations potentially.
The examples you're citing also involved ground troops. You said time for Maduro to go.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like regime change. Are you talking about troops on the ground?
I'll let the president speak to that. I'm talking about a briefing that would.
Notice he kept saying over and over again, yeah. And she's like, it sounds like you're talking about a coup. He's like, yeah. You're talking about troops on the ground. I'll let the president talk to that. So there seems to be hesitancy on that point. But from the standpoint of strikes and trying to overthrow them, that seems to be the game plan that these guys are working with. What was your experience when you're on the ground in Venezuela? I know you're saying they paved roads. The government was effectively using the oil revenue in order to build doctors and everything else. When you talk to people, what was the conversation? What was the feel of the place? And I know that sounds more esoteric, but I'm trying to get a sense of what it was like to be on the ground.
Well, I visited a farm cooperative in one of the rural areas where they grow chocolate, and I saw how they set that up, and it was a farm cooperative. I also I visited what was called the Center for African Knowledge, which is a building that they set up because there's a large amount of Afro-Venezuelans, Venezuelans that have African heritage, and there's a very large building called the Center for African Knowledge, and at the top of the building, it is a museum about Afro-Venezuelans and their history. And I guess Hugo Chavez, the founder of the revolutionary government, he actually was part, African in his heritage and was quite proud of it. That was the top of the building was this museum, but it was, instead of having like an elevator or a staircase, it had like a ramp that like circled around and to lead up to the top of the building. And it was all stores that had been set up that were owned by Afro-Venezuelans. So you went up through this building. It was all stores of Afro-Venezuelans who've been empowered by the Bolivarian government to start their own business, to make bags or sunglasses or whatever. And it was all these stores owned by Afro-Venezuelans. And then when you got to the top, it was a museum about Afro-Venezuelan heritage. And I remember that. And, one of the points that they made is that when Hugo Chavez was first elected president in 1999, Venezuela had 12 public universities. You know how many it has now? 32 public universities now. Yeah. Can you imagine the difference? I mean, the amount of public investment that they did. The other thing is that the notion that Venezuela is not a democracy, they have bent over backwards to be democratic, to be transparent. Every voting booth that they have, they have an audit. There's an electronic vote that has to match the paper record. They have to, they get a receipt when they vote, and so the paper receipt has to match the computer record, or else they have to recount the entire voting thing. I saw how they run the election. I mean, the opposition participates in the election. They have ads on television. They have protests and demonstrations against the government. Almost, all the mainstream media outlets are against the government. The notion that Venezuela is a dictatorship, it's just absurd. I saw people opposing the government and criticizing the government all the time in Venezuela. I mean, it's not a dictatorship in any conceivable way. And that just goes to show you that they will always say, that a country is a dictatorship. That's always going to be the response when you have a government the USA doesn't like. I mean, the opposition helped design the ballots, and then they boycott the election and they don't participate. And then they say, oh, look, it was rigged. Well, you didn't participate. The Venezuelan system is very transparent and it is very democratic. And there are people at this point that are trying to overthrow the government that have, at this point been boycotting elections. They claim it's not democratic just because they don't like the leadership. I mean, it's very much a democratic country. You can argue that some countries that are anti-imperialist are in kind of a military lockdown. Countries like North Korea, et cetera, or countries like China that have more of the old Soviet model of a political system. That's not Venezuela. I mean, they have multiple parties, they have debates. It's just simply. The notion that Venezuela is a dictatorship is just absurd. It just is not. And the Carter Center observed their elections and said that they were fair and free. And I went there and I saw the voting system. Venezuela is very, very much a democratic country.
What do you make of Machado winning the Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, it makes the Nobel Peace Prize a joke.
It does.
She's a warmonger. She wants to overthrow and invade her own country. She looks at how Libya is right now. She looks at how Iraq is. She looks at how Honduras became in the aftermath of the U.S. coup in 2009. And she says, my goodness, I want my own people to be like that. That's one thing I can't stand, I will say. As somebody who lives in the United States, I cannot stand these people who hate their own people so much that they come to America and want America to bomb and kill their own people. I really can't stand them. I don't like a lot of what the U.S. government does, but I don't go around the world. When I go to Russia, when I go to Iran, I don't say, all right, go bomb America, kill a bunch of Americans. I don't say that. I want America to have a better relationship with these countries. But these people that are just there, Fidel Castro calls them gusanos, crawlers or whatever. And I cannot stand the bomb my country crowd of people that are just so mad. You can watch a video I did a few years ago outside the UN when Maduro was there. And I argued with these right-wing Venezuelans that were protesting Maduro, and I just filmed them, and they were completely crazy. And there was one guy who claimed that he had AIDS. He said, well, I have AIDS. And I said, are you trying to claim Maduro gave you AIDS? No, he said, but I can't get the AIDS medicine that I want. Well, isn't that because of sanctions? Well, yeah, but and I'm just like, so and it's just and I would argue with them, and they just they really just hate their own people so much. And it's just, there's like a tribal ethnic component to it. Some of it is really blatant. I remember when I was in college, the leader of Brazil, Lula da Silva, had just been elected. Yeah. He was aligning himself with Nicolas Maduro and stuff, and it wasn't clear. Da Silva is not really a full-on revolutionary, but he was, it was not clear at that point, and Lula da Silva was elected. And so at my college, there were a number of Brazilian students, from Brazil, and so I remember I asked them, hey, what do you think of Lula, the president of Brazil? And they said, oh, he's horrible. He's a Marxist dictator. He's awful. He's just awful, and all of that. And I said, well, why does he win the elections and all of that? And they said, because we have this law in Brazil that everybody has to vote, you know, and so all these poor people, you know, who, you know, have no business voting and don't understand politics, they go and they vote for him and all this. And I said, well, why do they vote for him though? And they said, because he gives them all jobs. He just gives them all jobs and they vote for him. And I mean, it was really blatant. And they kept talking about, did you know he used to be a delivery man? He used to deliver packages for a living. Can you believe this? Brazil, we're a civilized country and we have a delivery man as our president. Oh my gosh, he delivered packages, you know. And I mean, it's really, really blatant. You know, the old hard right wing, the Gusano hard right wing. They have like an ethnic tribal hatred for the poorer people of their countries, right? And it is like they want them to die. They identify more with America than with their own people. They're kind of embarrassed and ashamed. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, when I was in the richer neighborhoods in Iran, you know, some of the wealthier Iranians who hate the Iranian government, who like admire the Shah, they would talk to me, you know, they're wearing blue jeans and they're, you know, driving their BMWs, and they'd say, you know, oh, you know, we're white people just like you, you know, Caleb, we're white people, you know, people, you in America, you think we're Arabs, you think, but we're actually Persians are white. And it's like, give me a break. I mean, it's like, there's an element of just, you know, I mean, it's from all over the world. These people that they hate their own people. They want their country to be bombed. They want to be like America. And it just disgusts me. And I get very angry with those kind of people. I mean, it's just something like, I feel like, you know, it just offends me on the level of like, you know, it's like, you should love your own family. You know what I'm saying? If you saw someone like, you know, like if your relative was being arrested or something, you know, you should be there for them. You shouldn't be testifying against them in court, or you shouldn't be, you know, supporting the police going after them. Even if they made a mistake or something, they're your relative. You got to be friendly to them. And I see these people who just, they hate their own homeland so much. They want the USA to, something's off about them. And it always just kind of grinds my gears. And what also I don't like is they pander to the ignorance of the American people. And that has always annoyed them, because people in America, they don't know, right? You know, and that, you know, if you come to America, you know, when you become a U.S. citizen, I mean, it says on the form, are you a communist? And you have to say no, right? I mean, and if you're a communist, you can be denied your citizenship, right?
It says that on the form?
Yeah, it's one of the questions.
Are you serious?
Yeah, you can't be a communist and become a U.S. citizen. So a lot of, you know, these folks come here, and if they were to say good things about the communist government they fled from, you know, they would obviously not be able to stay here. So they come here and they get attention. Oh, it was horrible. I fled the awful regime. It was horrible. It was horrible. You know, and Americans hear that and they think that's representative of how the people there feel. And that's what Americans want to hear, because that reinforces the narrative we all have. But, you know, in every former Eastern European country where, you know, since the fall of the Soviet Union, they've done poll after poll after poll where every single one of those countries, people say life was better before the fall of the Soviet Union. Right. Yeah. And, you know, in every single one of these countries. And, you know, I always get these people that will condescendingly say to me, Caleb, you know, haven't you ever talked to anyone who lived under communism? It's like, look at the polls, though. You know, I go to Russia. The Soviet nostalgia is very, very high in Russia. And in fact, in Russia, the Communist Party is considered the party of the elderly, the pensioners, you know, the people who lived under it, you know, and, you know, but you know, you get these people who come to the United States and they just pander to this ignorance, and people talk to some Miami Cuban, or they talk to somebody who grew up in Czechoslovakia or Romania, and they think they know the whole history of communism because, oh, I met this guy who, you know, lives down the street and he said it was totally horrible and America is the greatest country that ever existed. And it's like, yeah, he came here because he's on one side, you know, and that doesn't represent everyone in the country. And that, you know, so I don't know. I have very little patience for the crowd of people. And it's like, you look at the results of all the U.S. regime change wars, it never improves the country. And if you argue that with these people, which I have in the videos, you can watch the videos on my YouTube channel, they don't care. I mean, you say to them, look, you know, is Libya better off? Is Iraq better off? I know you're mad at the government. You know, you say they're so awful. Are they better off? It just doesn't, it doesn't care. It's about, they want vengeance against the government. That's what it's about. The government, you know, took my mansion. The government overtaxed me. The government redistributed my plantation or whatever. I want revenge against the government. I want these people killed. They don't care about the ultimate result for their country in the long term. They could care less, you know, and that's the important thing to remember about them. You know, the Miami Cubans, they don't care about Cuba getting better. They just want to overthrow the government. You know, when there was the SOS Cuba campaign going on. There were these Cubans marching around, SOS Cuba. It was like protests, an attempt at a color revolution in Cuba. I went to it and I asked all the people protesting that were saying SOS Cuba, I said, do you support the blockade? And they all said yes. Oh, yes, we support the blockade. So then how do you support Cuba then, right? There are Cubans who have diseases that could be cured if they could get the medicine. You say you support your people. Why do you support the blockade? And everybody say, oh, yes, we love the blockade. We support the blockade. So you care about the Cuban people, yet you support a blockade that's preventing them from getting medicine and food and all this. Give me a break,
Yeah, that's a particular pet peeve of mine too.
Yeah.
I mean, because look, it's as much as I despise the government of the U.S., these people are sociopaths. Nothing in me would want the U.S. bombed.
Exactly.
If that makes sense. Like my family lives here, right?
Yeah.
I don't hate Americans. I despise the government. There's a difference in those things. And, the push that I make is against the way that the government operates and the policies that the government takes on. Yeah, I think the public are Muppets in some respects, but I don't want them bombed and killed in the context of trying to change the government. Machado is out there screaming for the government to be attacked by the U.S. And it's like, okay, how do you give that person a quote unquote peace prize who's calling for war against their own population? And it's like when they do those airstrikes, for example, they've just murdered 27 people, 25 random people. Murder. Machado will probably have no issue with that.
Yeah.
That's amazing to me.
Yeah.
And if they do airstrikes, again, they're going to be murdering civilians because Venezuela is not part of the drug trade in the sense of putting fentanyl in the United States. So those targets is going to be against government targets with the idea of trying to overthrow the government. They're not going to be random. Trump may call them, we hit cocaine centers, but all intents and purposes is going to be issues associated with the government.
Yeah.
They're just going to murder people. She's okay with that. That's amazing to me. That's just mind-blowing to me. It's the blank check thing, right? Like you give these people a blank check, and because you give them a blank check that, hey, you have a superpower backing you, they feel that they can pretty much do anything because they have a superpower backing them. So we don't have to engage in a real political process. We can forego the elections and then claim that we were cheated. We can claim that he's a dictator. We can claim, et cetera, because there's a superpower backing us with a megaphone. That would 60 minutes in that story, you have person after person screaming that Maduro's a dictator.
Yeah,
it's amazing. They just, they're confirming. It's almost like they're building the case for an overthrow.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Well, I'll just say this, and then I probably have to go after this, but I'll just say this because I got a story I've got to hit the street. But let me just say this. Venezuela is very transparent. They have a very open system. But even countries like North Korea, even countries like China or countries like Iran, where their political system isn't as open, I would argue that those countries are more democratic than America. And I'll tell you why. Democracy means the rule of the people. That's what it means. The people rule. And Venezuela, they wouldn't be in power for a day if it wasn't for a huge network of well-organized people among the population that are organized in these things called Bolivarian circles that carry out the goals and the vision of the revolution on a local level. And in Iran, they have these things called Basij councils, the mobilized oppressed. And in every neighborhood, there's a Basij council that carries out the goals of the revolution. You go to China, the Communist Party, they're in every apartment building, every neighborhood. And the Chinese government wouldn't be in power if they didn't have a really well-organized section of the population that wakes up every day and says, I'm trying to carry out the Communist Party's goals. And in my neighborhood, I'm going to try to do what the Communist Party wants to do. And we don't have that in the West. Our leaders want us involved as little as possible. Our leaders could care less what we think. Whereas these governments, these anti-imperialist governments, to stay in power, they need the population to be heavily, heavily involved in carrying out their goals and activities. So even if they don't have the level of free speech or, the level of openness, they rely on citizen involvement and democratic participation. And that is something that you can't deny. Maduro needs those Bolivarian councils, and they are loyal to him and they carry out their goals. And that's why they're in power. And Iran needs those Basij councils, and China needs those local Communist Party organizers that they depend on citizen involvement to carry out their rule. And that's something that people who ramble about democracy, they think democracy means free speech or freedom of assembly. Well, democracy means the rule of the people. And in these countries, the people are way more involved in ruling than they are in America.
Caleb, you're awesome. You're awesome. I'm always informed when you come on the show, and I always appreciate you coming on this show. By the way, again, you have my deepest apologies for earlier.
All good. All good.
The time, like for example, it is 7:56 my time, which is like 50 minutes off kilter. It's just very weird. The time thing is very weird. I'm gonna have to get used to it. But you have my deepest apologies. I hate keeping people.
I love coming on your show. You always do great stuff. You have great guests. You always have a great lineup. I don't know how you keep track of all these people you have. You have so many great guests on your show. So, yeah.
It is a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. Caleb Alford, he is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst. He's author. He is also director for Center for Political Innovation. They do all sorts of stuff. These guys are very and super active. So you heard him talking about the people that he was engaging. Center for Political Innovation. Definitely look him up. Definitely check him out. Definitely check out his YouTube channel at Caleb Maupin. Caleb, I always say, man, I could listen to you for hours. You are so knowledgeable about such a wide range of things that I'm always informed when you come on the show. So thank you for it. You be safe.
Thank you.
Okay?
Talk to you soon. Yep. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Caleb has made a really interesting point that I want to hit just before I close. There is... Let's go to Dune for a moment. Let's go for Dune. In God Emperor Dune, a point was made that governments require a religion. He was making the point, all governments require religion. That was the argument that he made. Now, this doesn't mean worshiping Jesus. It doesn't mean in that sense. But I think what he's trying to communicate is something that Caleb just communicated. That when you're talking about what is a democratic system, it's a system that the public chooses. That's not imposed on the top down. Well, public can choose whatever it wants, meaning a government can organize itself in any particular fashion, or the public can organize itself in any particular fashion to accomplish the objective that the government is organized to accomplish. Is there a spiritual basis for the way that the government operates? Now, you can make a case that says communism is a materialistic spiritual basis backing government. Yeah, I'll go with that. And I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but the point that I'm getting is the spiritual basis for it is our job is to accomplish an objective, meaning it is a government that has a very specific objective in mind at the point where the government is formed. If it's a revolutionary government, for example, South Africa is another good example, where it's like we have a government that is trying to overturn decades of oppression associated with an apartheid state. All right, that is the goal. That is the objective. That is what we are. That is what we're here to do. Full stop. Now, do they accomplish it, yay or nay? Well, that's secondary to the point that the government didn't come into play just to come into play. The government came into play for a goal, for an objective. The revolutionary government in Iran, the communist government in China. We have a goal that we are set to accomplish. The government is not a thing unto itself. It's not just there just to be there. And yeah, you could say the government. You can say the government is in play. You can say the government is in play because they need to ensure the lives of people and everything else. Okay, fair enough. But is that enough? Does a government require a spiritual basis to operate? And again, I'm not talking about Jesus. The spiritual basis doesn't have to be esoteric. It doesn't have to be cosmic. It could be a materialistic sense. But in the materialistic sense, for example, China would say, the objective of this government is ensure the better lives of the human beings and the people that are in the government. So we're going to build roads. We're going to build infrastructure. We're going to build houses. We're going to build hospitals. We're going to build bridges, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to build high-speed rail. We're going to have airlines. We're going to build all of these industries. We're going to dominate AI. We're going to build the military to protect ourselves. Meaning our objective is to pull each and every person out of poverty and build a government that is the envy of the planet. That is our goal. So when China pulls 800 million people out of poverty, okay, well, the United States only has 320 million people. China pulled like 3 times as many people that exist in the United States out of poverty. That's mind-blowing. But again, if you have a spiritual basis to the way that your country operates, meaning your government is intact for a specific reason and objective, and you have a goal in mind in the context of the way that the government operates, is that necessary? And is that required for a country to remain a certain level of political cohesion in the way that the country operates? So, for example, ANC in South Africa. So the ANC in South Africa comes into play. We need to overturn decades of oppression of the Black majority that's in the country itself. How do we do that? We need to take some farms. We need to take some land. We need to take some of the wealth. We need to redistribute that wealth, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, they fail in that task. And so after 30 years, you get a, and I'm not bashing South Africa. I'm just pointing out there's a reason that the other political party, let's say the white political party, I can't think of the name of it right now, the Democratic Alliance, I think. There's a reason that they were able to get a shoehold or foothold into this kind of unity government that was created after the 30 years where the ANC's showing was less, failed at their task. Yes, they had a spiritual basis, the reason that they were developed, but they were not able to accomplish a spiritual basis for whatever particular reason. Maybe because you have a billionaire as a president. Revolutionary Guard in Iran, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. As Caleb is pointing out, there are elements of the population that actively work to accomplish a particular objective. Yes, the government is there in order to maintain betterment of the population and maintain the political affairs and everything else. But for all intents and purposes, the underlying basis for why that government was created, you can argue it's a spiritual, material spiritualism associated with the way that the government operates and why that government is in effect. We don't really have that. Like if you think about the way that the US operated, you could say we are an imperial democracy, if you want to call it that. But are we? I mean, when the Princeton study took place and it said 1% of what happens in our political affairs is influenced by the public, is that really you being part of the political process? Yes, you go vote, but does voting affect operation of corporations in the country? Does voting affect foreign policy? Does voting affect the genocide? Does voting affect, think of 1,000 things that happen within the context of the country and the things that the United States does. Does voting impact those things? Does it affect the way AI is being operated or how it would operate? Does it affect the way police operate within the country? Maybe you could pass a law to get something accomplished on a minimum scale. Does it affect you getting health care? No, none of these things are ultimately affected by the people who you put into political power. And yet, if the public was given an option, when you ask the public, what do you want? What they want versus what they get are radically different things. Is that democracy? Or is that a democracy in a way that the ceasefire in Gaza is a ceasefire? I don't know. Shout out to Caleb. Caleb is fantastic. Caleb is awesome. All right. We have come to the end. In fact, we've gone beyond the end. It is time conversion 10:19. It's 10:19. Almost all children grow without a father. That's not true. That's nonsense. Almost all. All right. I am going to say, what is this? In reality, government serves itself, preservation. Once established, it becomes an entity somehow. Yeah, well, that's everything. That's everything, by the way. Any organization that is created is almost like a life, and life tends to try to preserve itself. Companies, NATO, organizations, all of those things. The moment that they exist, they want to maintain their existence. Part of it is because they're jobs, right? Who wants to lose their job? like even in that context, who wants to lose whatever they have as a paycheck for the livelihood. There's an incentive in keeping those things alive. Agreed. They become a thing unto themselves. But that depends. Is there an underlying rationale for why the thing exists? In the sense of a government, if the answer is yes, well, you would think that the government would try to accomplish the objective. If it can't accomplish the objective that the government was created to accomplish, then the government is eventually going to fail. But if there was no objective, if the government is, we're a government for the people, by the people, etc. Okay, yeah, but is there another reason for that? You can argue that that's a reason in and of itself, but I don't know. Somehow that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. All right, I am going to end this. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. You can support this content, PayPal, Patreon, Super Chat, buy me a coffee, super stickers, etc. Kevin Wayne, good show, Jamal. Good show, Jamal. What is this? Ejamalicational. Glad Mark. I'm back. Yeah, Mark is back. Mark is fantastic also. He's a great guest. All right. Oh, by the way, Dmitry Lascaris, Daniel Lazar will be on the show tomorrow for a debate at 8 o'clock. This debate is going to deal with two issues. One has to do with the future of Gaza. And I think the other one has to do with, there were two questions. One was about genocide, and the other one was on the future of Gaza. That is going to be at 8 a.m. All of this came about. I don't know if you guys saw the show. Daniel Lazar came on the show after Dmitry and bashed Dmitry. And after bashing Dmitry, it was like, I'll debate him. He said it just outright, I'll debate him. He's like, guys like that don't like to debate. Dmitry, I said, dude, A, you don't know Dmitry. And him and I got into a back and forth over the fact that he bashed my guess. Dmitry was like, bring it on. I went to Daniel and said, hey, you don't know this guy. He's a lawyer. Would you like to actually pony up on your proclamation that he didn't want to debate? Daniel said, bring it on. I will talk to both. I was trying to get the debate on last week. It wasn't able to come on last week. So both of them are available tomorrow at 8 a.m. So both of them will be here tomorrow at 8 a.m. They will have the entire hour to make their case. And it should be very interesting. It should be very interesting. Feilu don't care for either. What? Get out of here, Feilu. Get out of here, Feilu. It should be very interesting. It's like grudge match. Grudge match. Lazar's gonna lie. He's not gonna. I don't think Lazar's gonna lie. Well, Dmitry. It should be a really good debate. It should be really good. Look, I can tell you. I know you guys have a sense, or you think some kind of way about Daniel. Daniel's a true believer. Like, this is not. He's not posturing. It's what he actually thinks. Which, whether I agree with him or disagree with him, I appreciate that more than, like, for example, I've had a conversation. I had a, I'll call it a debate, kind of, with Netanyahu's, I think it was like press consultant or something like that. It was maddening to talk to him. And it's maddening to talk to him because Israelis are usually full of shit. Just saying, just being honest. They're usually full of shit. And so when you're presenting something to them that's a flat fact, and that's true, or when you're presenting something that is obvious in regards to human beings. Like, for example, if I say, hey, you realize that if Palestinians don't have security, you're not going to have security, right? Like, that those people, after spending 70 years of oppressed, occupied, killed routinely, that they will feel some kind of way about you doing that. And it's like, well, the Palestinians are attacking us and they're, attacking us constantly and blah, 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 blah. There was one Israeli that I had an honest conversation with. But at that point, I wasn't even in the politics. Him and I were, ironically, in Nepal, and we were heading to a bungee jumping site. And just so happened that him and a friend of his were on the bus. They heard me talking to somebody about being in Palestine. And I could see him at the corner of my eye walking all the way over to where I was because he wanted to have a conversation about the fact that I mentioned Palestine. I didn't even know that guy. He just wanted to talk about it. And this was not a conversation I wanted to have, right? And as we're talking about it, I'm like, well, dude, I mean, when you're traveling, I was 30 years old, wasn't in the best of health. I was uremic. At the time, my transplant kidney had failed. And so I was basically being poisoned. And I was still going from place to place. I was in Bethlehem. I was in Israel, Bethlehem. And then it's like you had to cross over into Egypt. I forget the order. But when you're in Muslim countries, you see what they don't show you in America. Like you see them destroying olive trees. You see them destroying homes. You see them killing people. Like you see it. It shows on the news, on the media, just on random news, regular news. And so the point where you're going into Israel and you're having a conversation with them, all of this stuff is frustrating your mind in the sense of like, well, dude, you're destroying olive groves. You're doing this, you're doing that. And there's an excuse for everything, right? Well, we destroy the olive trees because, sometimes they plant bombs in those trees. Or we were destroying their homes because blah, 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 blah. It's infuriating to have those conversations. And at some point in the conversation, you realize, okay, but this guy isn't attacking me. He's not like meaning I wasn't attacking him. I was just pointing out, this is what you guys are doing. And he became a person. And he says, look, I understand how this looks. I get it. I live in occupied territory. And I saw the people responded to me as a result of the things that we did. And I was like, thank you. For fuck's sake, thank you. Just be honest, right? You want the land. This is not a religious argument. You want the land. Somebody is you want to take the land that somebody else is living on. And you were given the military force by Europe and the United States to do so. So that's what you're doing. Full stop. Everything else is an excuse. And it's an excuse that is so ingrained into the way that the country operates that it's the lie that they continuously tell themselves. It's like in slavery, right? Where it's like, well, black people are inferior. That's why they're slaves. Really? Is that why they're slaves? Is that why? It has nothing to do with you doing that. You fashioning a man into a farm animal of sorts. It's the lie they tell themselves. Every bit as much as America told itself all of these lies in order to justify slavery and Jim Crow and all this other stuff. Apartheid state. Yeah. Oh, we have chats. Kevin Wayne. Caleb's, what is this? Cool, kind of like him now. He is. He is. He is. He really is. And Garland Nixon is in the house. Free Venezuela indeed. Well, currently they are, but they're being murdered. So Garland Nixon is the guy that got me into radio. He would have my appreciation. I know I say it all the time, but it's true. My appreciation forever for that. He hit me up and invited me on the show. And I was hooked. Day one hooked. Something in me was like, this is what you want to do. This is what you want to do. Yeah, Garland Nixon is in the house. Check out his channel, by the way, Garland Nixon Show. He has fantastic guests. He has a damn good channel. Definitely check him out. He is awesome. No, he's here. In fact, Garland comes on every Wednesday. Every Wednesday at 9:15. Yeah, Colin's the man. All right, we are going to bring this to an end. You said I have the ceiling that you have. I've seen that in other places. How did you meet Nixon? Garland was on Fault Lines. He was doing Fault Lines radio show, and they have guests and everything else. Basically, this format. And he invited me onto the show to be a guest. I think Cameron was the producer at the time. And at the time, I was living in Richmond. I was doing my channel, and I drove up to DC for it. First time on radio, and I loved it. I loved it. There's something about putting on a set of headphones and speaking into a mic that just works, and it feels, I don't know, there's a formality to it. There's a formality to it. Like doing a radio show is a bit different than doing a YouTube channel. For one, you have to watch your language. For one, you have to be more exacting in regards to time scale and everything else. But it's regimented in the way that it operates. And I don't know, the formality gives it a different feel, a different flavor to it. But I was hooked. I was completely hooked. So anytime they wanted me, I would take that drive 2 hours, hour 45 minutes to go to Washington, D.C. in order to do the show. And after a few years, I moved to D.C. To start Political Misfits. And from Political Misfits, Fault Lines, and what was there for like 5 years? So, but yeah. All right, let's call this a day. I think I want to get some chess in, so I may play some chess after this. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. I want to thank all of you for joining me. We had a really good crowd today. We hit over 1,000. I think that's everything. I will see you guys bright and early tomorrow morning. You be safe, be kind to the degree that you can be kind. And you all have a beautiful, lovely day. Have a good one all.